Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. At the beginning of the Harry Potter saga, Lucius Malfoy appears as an influential, proud and wealthy wizard. He was at the top too, and as often happens in such stories, a fall was bound to follow. Today, we'll look beyond the icy facade of Malfoy's arrogance and uncover how he rose so high and why he lost it all. You'll learn little-known and intriguing facts about Lucius's life. Enjoy the video. Number 1. Becoming a Death Eater. After graduating from Hogwarts, Lucius never bothered to look for a job. There was simply no need. His status allowed him to engage in far more influential matters. He generously donated to the right officials, frequently visited the Ministry of Magic, and knew how to manipulate the system. But behind this polished image lay a much darker truth. Lucius became a Death Eater. His money, connections, and pure-blood heritage made him a valuable ally to Voldemort. The Malfoys saw the Dark Lord's ideology as a way to restore lost control over the world. One moment stands out, the diary Horcrux. Voldemort entrusted it to Lucius in secret, and he obeyed without question. But when the Dark Lord vanished, Lucius decided to use the artifact for his own agenda, smuggling it into Hogwarts in hopes of discrediting Arthur Weasley. He had no idea the diary was not just dark magic. It was a piece of Voldemort's soul. Number 2. Escaping Azkaban twice. After Voldemort's initial downfall, many Death Eaters were sent to Azkaban. Lucius avoided prison by claiming he had been under the Imperious curse. A few hefty bribes helped seal the deal, and he walked away unpunished. But everything changed when Voldemort returned. Learning that Lucius had not only abandoned him, but had also used a Horcrux without permission, the Dark Lord demoted him within the ranks. His only shot at redemption was a dangerous mission: retrieve the prophecy about Harry Potter from the Department of Mysteries. Lucius failed. The result? Arrest and Azkaban. In retaliation, Voldemort assigned Draco a death mission to kill Dumbledore. The Malfoys cracked. They no longer believed, they feared. It was fear that made Narcissa lie about Harry's death. That lie, a pivotal moment, led to Voldemort's defeat, and once again, Lucius escaped prison. This time by cooperating with the Ministry of Magic. Number 3. The Malfoys owe their fortune to Muggles. Perhaps the most ironic part of all, their fortune. Though modern Malfoys boasted of their disdain for Muggles, it was precisely the Muggles who made them powerful in the first place. During the time of William the Conqueror, one of the Malfoy ancestors aided the king in the Norman invasion by using dark magic and behind-the-scenes scheming. In return, he was granted land, a castle, and noble titles. For centuries, the Malfoys secretly influenced the English court, mating enemies of the crown, helping win wars, and arranging marriages between key heirs. Their influence in the Muggle world was unmatched, but all changed after the International Statute of Secrecy was enacted. Muggles were no longer useful. From then on, the Malfoys began to distance themselves, cultivating their ideology of blood purity and hate, which makes it all the more ironic that the very family who prides itself on pure blood owes everything to those they now despise. Number 4. Lucius was a prefect and member of the Slug Club. To understand who Lucius became, we must look at his youth. When he entered Hogwarts, his family already had an imposing reputation, wealth, connections, and pure blood lineage. Although he kept a low profile, the canon offers glimpses. In the Deathly Hallows, it's mentioned that by the time Snape started school, Lucius was already a prefect, several years older than the Marauders. He was talented and charismatic courtier, and the professors noticed. But one detail is especially important. Lucius was part of the elite Slug Club, an invitation-only group created by Professor Slughorn for students with special potential. Draco never got that honor. By his time, his father's reputation was already tarnished. Number 5. Family life and hidden conflicts. Lucius Malfoy married Narcissa Black for legacy, but he stayed with her out of something far stronger: fear and admiration. She wasn't just the quiet wife behind the scenes, she saw what he couldn't. When Lucius wanted to shape Draco into his image, Narcissa refused. "He's not you," she once said. "He still has time." Lucius didn't argue. He never did when she used that tone. During the rise of Voldemort, when Lucius pushed Draco toward the Death Eaters, Narcissa pulled him back. She didn't shout. She planned, quietly, ruthlessly. It was Narcissa, not Lucius, who risked her life to lie to Voldemort at the Battle of Hogwarts. "Is he alive?" she whispered to Harry. When he said yes, she told the Dark Lord otherwise. That moment saved their son, and saved them all. Lucius stood behind her in silence, watching his empire fall and realizing that the only thing left worth protecting had never been his gold or his name. It was her, and Draco, the two people he had nearly lost to a war he no longer believed in. Number 6. Relationship with Severus Snape. Lucius Malfoy first noticed Severus Snape in the dungeon corridors of Hogwarts, quiet, intense, always alone. Unlike most Slytherins, Snape didn't seek approval. That intrigued Lucius. He saw potential, raw, unpolished, but powerful. Even after graduating, Lucius kept an eye on him. When the time came to expand Voldemort's inner circle, it was Lucius who whispered Snape's name. "He's no politician," Lucius had said, "but he sees more than any of us." For a time, they worked in tandem. Snape's potions, Lucius's gold. Snape offered silence, Lucius offered protection. But after Voldemort's return, everything shifted. Snape rose while Lucius fell. He became Voldemort's eyes in Dumbledore's office. Lucius was humiliated, stripped of trust. At Malfoy Manor, when Snape arrived with news or orders, Lucius watched him with something between resentment and fear. "You've changed, Severus," he once muttered. Snape didn't answer. Toward the end, Lucius began to suspect. The way Snape moved, the way he spoke to Narcissa, the way Voldemort looked at him. There were whispers Lucius didn't understand, and he hated not understanding. But it no longer mattered. Snape had power, Lucius had none, and so he did what he never imagined he'd do. He stayed silent, let the younger man lead, and in that silence, the last bond between them quietly broke. Number 7. Losing influence in the Ministry of Magic. There was a time when Lucius Malfoy didn't need to raise his voice to make the Ministry listen. A donation here, a dinner there, and Cornelius Fudge would glance the other way. Laws were adjusted, investigations delayed. In the Order of the Phoenix, Arthur Weasley warned, "Lucius Malfoy has a lot of influence at the Ministry." It was true, Lucius wasn't just a wealthy man, he was a puppeteer, and the Ministry danced on his strings. But that all changed the night he stepped into the Department of Mysteries with a mask on his face and a wand in his hand. When Harry exposed him as a Death Eater, everything unraveled. Cornelius Fudge resigned under pressure, and Rufus Scrimgeour rose to power. Unlike his predecessor, Scrimgeour had no intention of playing host to former Death Eaters. One of his first actions was to freeze the Malfoy vaults and reopen long-ignored corruption inquiries. Lucius found himself locked out of every door he once opened with a smile. Even his so-called allies vanished. The old pureblood families, the Knotts, the Flints, the Carrows, now avoided him. He was no longer a benefactor, but a liability. In meetings he once chaired, his name was barely whispered. Lucius, the man who once shaped the Ministry's policies from behind the curtain, was now just another shadow in the hallway. And for the first time, no amount of gold could buy him back in. Number 8. Psychological breakdown and loss of faith in ideals. By the final year of the war, Lucius Malfoy was a ghost of the man he used to be. His robes were still tailored, his hair still perfect. But his eyes had changed. Hollow. Afraid. When the Death Eaters occupied Malfoy Manor, he no longer ruled the house. Voldemort did. And Lucius, once proud and commanding, was reduced to silence. He flinched when spoken to. He avoided the Dark Lord's gaze. He looked as though every bone in his body had been broken and reassembled wrong, Harry later recalled, in the Deathly Hallows. Then came the night Draco was nearly killed during the battle inside Hogwarts. And later, the moment in the Forbidden Forest when Narcissa bent over Harry and lied to Voldemort. Lucius didn't stop her. He didn't even protest. He only watched, trembling. That was the moment something broke completely. The cause, the ideology, the bloodlines, none of it mattered anymore. Only Draco did, only the family he'd nearly destroyed in his hunger for legacy. When Voldemort fell, Lucius didn't run. He didn't fight. He just stood still, clutching his wife's hand, searching the crowd for his son, not for victory, not for forgiveness, but for survival, for something real. For the first time, Lucius Malfoy had no master and no mask to wear, just an old man who had finally realized he'd been fighting for a lie. Number 9. Secret aid to the Order of the Phoenix. It began with a name scribbled on old parchment, then another and another. The list found its way to Kingsley Shacklebolt's desk late one evening, unsigned, unmarked, but painfully accurate. Within days, Aurors apprehended 2 former Death Eaters hiding in northern Scotland, exactly where the note said they'd be. The handwriting was later matched to Lucius Malfoy. When confronted, he simply said, "I've buried too many ghosts." He never asked for a deal, never explained his reasons. Inside the Order of the Phoenix, the news caused division. Molly Weasley was furious. "We don't need help from the likes of him," she told Shacklebolt. But others, Remus Lupin among them, had long suspected Lucius's loyalties had frayed. "He's not doing this for us," Remus once said quietly. "He's doing it for his son." Indeed, the information Lucius provided helped dismantle one of the last hidden cells of Voldemort's loyalists. Without his help, more lives might have been lost. The Ministry kept it quiet. The official report called it an anonymous tip-off, but those who knew the truth understood why Lucius never stood trial a third time. His silence, once a tool of power, became a shield of penance. Not a hero, not a traitor. Just a man trying, in the end, to undo a little of the damage he'd caused. Number 10. Final Years and the Legacy of Lucius Malfoy. Lucius Malfoy spent his final years behind the iron gates of Malfoy Manor. The grandeur remained, but the halls were quieter. The guests stopped coming. The name no longer commanded fear, only whispers. He no longer walked the halls of the Ministry, nor attended the galas he once dominated. After Voldemort's fall, Lucius withdrew from public life with the same precision he once used to control it. The man who had once bought ministers with bags of galleons now spent days in silence, watching his son from afar. There were rumors, of course, that Lucius, broken and aging, began writing letters he never sent, that he admitted to Nott and Avery during their rare visits how wrong he had been. Harry Potter once mentioned to Hermione that Severus Snape had spoken of Lucius as a man who confused power with purpose and paid the price. These weren't confessions. Lucius never begged forgiveness, but those close enough could see the weight pressing on him. Not guilt, but grief. For the life he'd chosen, and the family nearly lost because of it. Draco, now a father himself, chose a quieter legacy. He did not seek the spotlight, nor did he teach his son Scorpius the values Lucius once held dear. In The Cursed Child, Draco admits, "I used to be ashamed of what we were, now I'm trying to make sure my son never feels that." That sentence alone is perhaps Lucius's true legacy, a mirror turned away from the past towards something softer. Draco learned not only from the teachings but from the cracks in his father's image. In the end, Lucius was remembered less for the fear he inspired and more for the silence he left behind. His name faded from the headlines, from ministry records, from war memorials. But in the quiet moments, when Draco paused too long before speaking, or when Scorpius looked uncertainly at the family crest, the shadow of Lucius Malfoy was still there. Not as a villain, not even as a warning, but as a man who could not outrun the world he helped build. Number 11. Lucius and the Dark Artifacts, collector or criminal. Lucius Malfoy's obsession with ancient magical artifacts was more than a hobby. It was a lifelong pursuit wrapped in secrecy and shadows. Deep within the dungeons of Malfoy Manor, behind wards known only to the darkest branches of wizarding bloodlines, he kept a private collection that would make even the most seasoned unspeakable pause. Cursed relics, forbidden tomes, daggers etched with blood runes. These were not just historical curiosities. They were weapons, evidence, and sometimes memories of war. The Ministry had banned many of them after the first rise of Voldemort. Lucius kept them anyway. He didn't just hoard them, he restored them, researched them, and traded them through underground channels. One artifact in particular was spoken of in hushed tones, the Canva wand. Said to have belonged to a medieval warlock who could control Inferi without incantations, it vanished during the Great Plague. Lucius acquired it from a Romanian collector named Stefan Balan, whose sudden disappearance in 1983 was never solved. When Voldemort returned, he chose Malfoy Manor to hide his diary Horcrux, not only because he trusted Lucius, but because he knew the manor could swallow dark power without echo. After the fall of the Dark Lord, the Ministry raided the estate. Much of Lucius's hoard was confiscated and locked in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement's high-risk vaults. But whispers in Nocturne Alley claimed that Narcissa Malfoy managed to save a few pieces. Items wrapped in silk and silence, hidden behind moving panels or protected by blood charms. One supposed survivor, a black mirror that could reflect not your face, but your guilt. No official record confirms its existence. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Lucius is described as someone whose cold, drawling voice carried authority as if he owned everything around him. Chapter 4. That voice, full of calculated elegance, was the same one that negotiated with collectors, silenced Ministry inquiries, and protected his relics from the flames of war. Was he a scholar of the arcane, or a criminal dressed in heritage? Perhaps both, but one thing remained certain. Lucius Malfoy understood the weight of magical history. He just preferred to keep it chained in the dark. Number 12. His rivalry with Arthur Weasley, more than political. Of all the rivalries embedded within the wizarding world, the relationship between Lucius Malfoy and Arthur Weasley was one of the most layered and quietly intense. Though the books portray them as enemies drawn from opposite sides of the political spectrum, one a proud Death Eater and the other a humble government employee with a fondness for Muggle plugs, there was far more beneath the surface than a simple ideological divide. Their animosity masked decades of competition, fear, and reluctant respect that had festered since their early days at Hogwarts. Lucius Malfoy, born into the old and aristocratic Malfoy family, carried the name of a lineage that prided itself on blood purity and political influence. He was groomed from an early age to view himself as superior not just to Muggles and half-bloods, but to any wizard who failed to uphold the traditions of elite wizarding society. Arthur Weasley, though only a year behind Lucius at Hogwarts, belonged to a completely different world. The Weasleys, though technically purebloods, were poor, outspoken, and sympathetic toward Muggles. From their very first encounter, the two young wizards embodied clashing worldviews. The seeds of rivalry were planted in the quiet spaces between classes and corridors of Hogwarts. While Lucius found power in his association with influential Slytherins, Arthur spent his time in Gryffindor Tower, surrounded by a very different kind of strength: honor, curiosity, and moral clarity. Though the books never detail direct confrontations from their school years, the tension was likely already forming. The Weasleys were everything the Malfoys disdained, yet Arthur refused to flinch in the face of that disdain. He didn't seek Lucius out, he simply existed in defiance of him. Decades later, when both men were firmly entrenched in the Ministry of Magic, their paths crossed regularly, and the old rivalry only deepened. Lucius held no official ministry position, yet he wielded more influence than many department heads through donations and political maneuvering. Arthur, by contrast, worked in the obscure misuse of Muggle artifacts office, underfunded, underappreciated, and mocked by his peers. Still, it was Arthur who often posed the greater threat. His integrity was incorruptible, and to someone like Lucius, that made him dangerous. Lucius was used to buying silence, loyalty, or complicity. Arthur offered none of these. Instead, he raised questions that others were too intimidated to ask. Over the years, Arthur submitted dozens of reports linking the Malfoys to illegal dark artifacts, many of which were quietly dismissed or buried. Yet Arthur persisted, often alone. His lack of ambition made him immune to most forms of pressure. That was what truly unsettled Lucius, not Arthur's power, but his refusal to be swayed. The encounter in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets brought their rivalry into the open. When Lucius slipped Tom Riddle's diary into Ginny Weasley's cauldron at Flourish and Blots, it wasn't just a plan to reopen the chamber. It was a personal strike against Arthur. If Ginny had been discovered with the diary before Harry unravelled the truth, the scandal would have destroyed the Weasley name. Lucius wanted to shame Arthur, to remind the wizarding world that no one was safe from the consequences of defying the Malfoys. He almost succeeded. The confrontation in Flourish and Blots was a rare moment where their disdain broke the surface. Lucius, with his cold sneer, derided the Weasley family for their poverty and filthy little blood traitor values. Arthur lunged at him in a rage, fists flying, the mask of civility torn away. It was not just a father defending his daughter, it was the release of years of quiet, repressed fury. Molly Weasley's words, "He's not worth it, Arthur," might have been true, but in that moment Arthur had to strike back. Later, when Dobby was freed and Lucius was nearly unmasked for his involvement with the diary, the balance of power shifted. Arthur knew it wasn't enough to convict Lucius. Too many layers of bureaucracy, too many favours owed. But it was a blow. Lucius, for all his composure, must have felt the ground under his feet shift ever so slightly. The world was changing, and men like Arthur were no longer so easily silenced. During the Second Wizarding War, Lucius fell. Not in the dramatic sense of death or disgrace, but in a far more humiliating way. He became irrelevant. Stripped of Voldemort's favour, imprisoned, and later released under watch, Lucius faded into the shadows of Malfoy Manor, his influence reduced to whispers. Arthur, meanwhile, rose, not in rank, he never sought that, but in moral standing. He became a quiet symbol of resistance and stability, a reminder that goodness need not roar to be heard. What the books do not reveal, but what some members of the Weasley family later whispered about, was what happened after the war. Ron Weasley once mentioned, almost offhandedly, to a younger Aura at the ministry that Lucius had sent Arthur a letter, not of apology, but of acknowledgement. It arrived in a heavy silver envelope, unmarked, with only a single sentence scrawled inside. "You never crossed the line. For that, you have my respect." This alleged letter caused a stir among those who heard about it, but Arthur never confirmed or denied its existence. Some believe he burned it. Others say he kept it hidden in a drawer beneath a collection of confiscated Muggle trinkets. Regardless of its fate, the notion that Lucius could set aside his pride, even briefly, to express gratitude speaks volumes. For all his cruelty and prejudice, he had always feared becoming the kind of man Arthur might have been had he let hate consume him. There's a kind of poetry in the way their lives unfolded. Lucius, with all his wealth, ended up shackled by fear of Voldemort, of failure, of his own legacy. Arthur, despite hardship, grew stronger with time, surrounded by a family who loved and respected him. He never held office, never demanded recognition, yet his legacy outshined Lucius's in every way that mattered. Number 13. Raising Draco, between pride and fear. Lucius Malfoy stood at the edge of the marble staircase in Malfoy Manor, watching his young son chase enchanted moths beneath the chandelier. The child's laughter echoed in the vast hall, but Lucius remained motionless, his pale fingers resting on the serpent head of his cane. Even then, long before the darkness descended upon the wizarding world, Lucius was already drafting the path for Draco, a path paved with ambition, tradition, and rigid expectations. He did not believe in randomness. In the world of Lucius Malfoy, lineage was legacy, and every child was not only a blessing, but a vessel through which family power continued. As the heir of an ancient and noble house, Draco was born not simply to live, but to embody. Lucius invested in that child every whispered lesson he had learned from his own father, lessons of aristocratic decorum, of selective kindness, of power, wielded not with brute force, but with subtle influence. Draco's education began at home, long before Hogwarts opened its doors to him. Tutors came and went through the manor, each assigned a very specific role. History of magic was taught not through general curriculum, but from the Malfoy family's own recorded chronicles. Potions were not taught in bubbling cauldrons, but beside shelves lined with centuries-old vials. Lucius demanded elegance in magic, precision in language, and above all, control over emotion. Strength, he believed, came not from raw power, but from restraint. That control was essential. Lucius remembered too well the rise and fall of the first Dark Lord, and though he claimed he had acted under duress, the mark on his arm never quite faded in the eyes of the world. Fear of vulnerability wrapped around his parenting like a second cloak. He wanted Draco shielded not only by magic, but by a demeanor so aloof, so superior, that no one would dare strike first. The pride he took in his son was immense, but it was laced with something else, an almost frantic urgency to mold him into a bastion of the old world before that world collapsed. When Draco boarded the Hogwarts Express for the first time, Lucius did not offer a hug. He offered warnings. "You'll find that some wizarding families are better than others, Draco. Remember that." His voice was sharp, but his eyes lingered. He wasn't simply instilling prejudice. He was reinforcing a fortress. He was preparing his son for a battlefield where lineage was both armor and target. Inside Lucius lived a fear that one day the Malfoy name would not command reverence, but provoke rebellion. In Hogwarts, Draco thrived, but in a way that was half imitation, half performance. He carried himself with his father's aristocratic drawl, echoed his disdain for Muggle-borns, and mimicked Lucius's mannerisms with unsettling accuracy. Teachers noted his confidence, his sarcasm, his hunger for status. But beneath that bravado was a boy desperate for approval. Lucius wrote often, never in the language of affection, but in the lexicon of legacy. "Make your house proud, associate with those of standing, be wary of Dumbledore, he coddles mediocrity." The pressure only intensified with time. When Draco failed to outperform Hermione Granger in exams or lost the Quidditch Cup, Lucius would not scold, he would withdraw. That absence spoke louder than anger. Draco, still a boy, absorbed the message. Disappointment was failure, and failure had no place in the house of Malfoy. The turning point came not at Hogwarts, but after. When Lord Voldemort returned, the Malfoys were summoned. This time, Lucius could not bribe, manipulate, or charm his way out. The Dark Lord demanded loyalty, and payment came in the form of Draco. The boy, just 16, was assigned the task of assassinating Albus Dumbledore. It was not only a suicide mission, it was a public trial, orchestrated by Voldemort to punish Lucius for past failures. And Lucius knew it. In the cold halls of Malfoy Manor, Lucius paced more than spoke. For the first time, his control faltered. Narcissa saw it. His trembling hands, the sleepless nights, the way he avoided looking Draco in the eyes. He had raised his son to be poised and ruthless, but nothing in those teachings prepared Draco for this, and worse, Lucius could do nothing to stop it. At Hogwarts, Draco's transformation was visible. The arrogance dimmed, the pride turned inward into silence, isolation. He no longer mocked others with flair. Instead, he disappeared into shadowy corridors, plotting, hesitating, failing. He repaired the vanishing cabinet, but never cast the final spell. His wand trembled. Lucius had taught him to manipulate, but not to murder. In the end, it was Severus Snape who cast the fatal curse, sparing Draco from crossing that line. Lucius watched from the sidelines as his family was dragged deeper into the war. Malfoy Manor became a prison, its halls echoing not with laughter, but with screams from the cellar. The grandeur of the house could not mask the terror that ruled it. Lucius had always stood for control, but now he was a man unraveling. His voice cracked when speaking to Voldemort. His wand hand faltered. The once proud patriarch had become a shadow. Even Voldemort noticed. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, the Dark Lord mocked him. "How will your son fare with a broken wand, Lucius?" The cruelty was deliberate. Lucius's status meant nothing anymore. Power had shifted, and he could not stop it. He sat silent at the long table, Narcissa pale beside him, Draco mute with fear. The dynasty was dying before his eyes. And yet, in those final moments, something changed. At the Battle of Hogwarts, Lucius made no attempt to fight. When Narcissa lied to Voldemort about Harry's death, Lucius did not argue. He did not object when she left the battlefield to find their son. He followed. He did not stay to defend the cause. He chose family. That single decision, made in fear and love, severed the last tether to Voldemort's world. Number 14, why Voldemort stopped trusting Lucius. When Voldemort returned to life, summoned back through blood and sacrifice in the graveyard of Little Hangleton, there was one man among his former followers who waited, not out of fear for the Dark Lord, but for fear of the consequences should he choose the wrong side too soon. Lucius Malfoy, once a trusted lieutenant, a pure-blood aristocrat cloaked in the grandeur of old magic and old money, remained in the shadows while others fell to their knees. And Voldemort, though reborn in flesh, had returned with memories, sharp, venomous memories of betrayal, cowardice, and pride. Lucius had expected a different reception. In the years of Voldemort's absence, he had played a careful game. He distanced himself from the crimes of the First Wizarding War, claiming to have been under the imperious curse. He preserved his estate, his wealth, his influence in the ministry. He became a patron of power, not of ideology. And when whispers began to rise again, when the dark mark stirred faintly on his arm, he waited for confirmation, waited for certainty. And Voldemort noticed. The fall of trust did not begin with the Second War. It began with a diary. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Lucius Malfoy slipped an old, cursed journal into the cauldron of a young girl at Flourish and Blots. What seemed like a petty vengeance against the Weasleys was in fact the reckless use of a Horcrux, a sacred object containing a fragment of Voldemort's soul. Lucius had no idea of its true nature, or perhaps worse, he suspected but did not care. He saw it as a weapon. He saw it as a chance to embarrass Arthur Weasley and destabilize the ministry. Voldemort, had he been alive then, would have seen it as desecration. Years later, when Tom Riddle returned and learned what had become of the diary, his fury was quiet but absolute. Horcruxes were not toys. Lucius had lost not just an artifact, but a piece of his master's immortality. This act of carelessness, disguised as strategy, revealed something that Voldemort could never forgive. Lucius placed his ambition above his loyalty. In the eyes of the Dark Lord, this was not merely foolish, it was sacrilege. Still, Voldemort did not strike immediately. Upon his return in Goblet of Fire, Lucius was welcomed among the gathered Death Eaters, standing once more in the circle of darkness. But Voldemort's tone that night was telling. "You, Lucius, my slippery friend." It was not a greeting, it was a warning, a man forgiven but not forgotten, trust withheld behind a veil of formality. The loyalty expected now was absolute, unthinking, without hesitation. Voldemort had learned from his mistakes. The next blow came in the Department of Mysteries. Ordered to retrieve the prophecy from the Hall of Prophecies, Lucius was given what might have been a second chance. He led the Death Eaters into the heart of the ministry, believing himself once again a general, a man of cunning and control. But he underestimated the children of Dumbledore's army. He underestimated Harry Potter. And most of all, he underestimated the unpredictability of war. The plan failed. The prophecy was destroyed. Several Death Eaters were captured, including Bellatrix Lestrange's husband, Rodolphus, and his brother, Rabastan. Lucius barely escaped with his life. For a second time, he had cost Voldemort something irreplaceable. This time, not an object, but information that could have shifted the balance of the entire war. The consequences were swift and merciless. Voldemort did not lash out publicly, but the silence spoke louder than a curse. Lucius was not punished with pain, he was punished with disgrace. By Half-Blood Prince, the hierarchy among Death Eaters had changed. Lucius no longer held a position of influence. Voldemort no longer trusted him to lead, to act, or to think. The Dark Lord turned instead to Lucius's son, Draco, a child, a schoolboy. Voldemort knew precisely what he was doing. He handed Draco a suicide mission to murder Albus Dumbledore, a task impossible for a boy of 16. It was never about the act itself. It was about sending a message to Lucius. Stripped of power, Lucius watched as his wife grew desperate, his son more frightened by the day. Voldemort took up residence in Malfoy Manor. He made their home into a base of operations, then into a prison. The portraits on the walls, the family crest etched into the stone, they meant nothing now. Narcissa tiptoed through her own halls. Lucius drank in silence. Their wealth could no longer shield them. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, the final humiliation came. After capturing Harry, Ron, and Hermione, the Malfoys were the first to falter. Narcissa begged for confirmation that the prisoner was Harry, hoping for favour. Lucius stood by, dishevelled, desperate. And Voldemort, upon returning, took Lucius's wand, not as a gift, but as an assertion of dominance. "Give me your wand." That moment, brief and devastating, symbolized the end. Lucius had nothing Voldemort needed. Not loyalty, not power, not courage. Only tools, only fear. Voldemort used Lucius as a symbol to the Death Eaters. He was a cautionary tale. Powerless, obedient, stripped of dignity, the nobleman broken under the weight of shame. Voldemort no longer trusted him even to guard prisoners. Even when Luna Lovegood, Mr. Ollivander, and Griphook were held beneath the manor, the task of control was given to others. Bellatrix, cruel and mad, rose in favour. Lucius sank. There was no redemption in Voldemort's eyes. Lucius had been tested and failed, again and again. When the final battle approached, he did not fight. He searched the battlefield not for victory, but for his son. He passed through the Great Hall not as a warrior, but as a father, a man who had, in the end, chosen blood over ideology, a man no longer trying to serve the Dark Lord, only to survive him. Number 15. What happened to the Malfoys? After the war, after the fall of Voldemort, few names in the wizarding world carried the same weight of infamy and unease as that of Lucius Malfoy. Once among the most influential pure bloods in the British wizarding aristocracy, Lucius was no longer greeted with bows or handshakes. Instead, whispers trailed him, eyes narrowed with suspicion, and his name was spoken with cold disdain. His once majestic presence, defined by a silver serpent cane and impeccable robes, gradually faded into a shadow of what it had once been. The ministry, freshly purged of Death Eater sympathizers and infused with a renewed sense of justice, did not treat Lucius with leniency out of pity. Rather, it was Narcissa Malfoy's quiet heroism during the Battle of Hogwarts that saved them all. Her lie to Voldemort, whispered in the forest when she claimed Harry Potter was dead, was an act that turned the tide of the war. It was not done for political maneuvering, nor even for Dumbledore's cause. It was done for Draco. That act, small but pivotal, spared the Malfoys from Azkaban, yet no pardon comes without cost. Lucius was never again seen walking through the atrium of the Ministry of Magic with the regal arrogance he once displayed. The opulent Malfoy Manor, with its dark relics and cold grandeur, was seized temporarily by the Ministry and combed through by auras for cursed objects, secret chambers, and any remaining traces of the Dark Lord's influence. Many of the artifacts, especially those associated with dark magic, were permanently confiscated. A few were quietly destroyed. Though the manor was eventually returned, the Malfoys were forbidden from participating in public affairs. Lucius, once a member of the Hogwarts Board of Governors, was stripped of all titles and roles. His Gringotts vaults were frozen, assets were liquidated, generations of wealth tied to influence and old alliances were sold off to pay reparation fines, bribes, and legal counsel, a once mighty empire reduced to a whisper of its former self. Lucius, proud and fastidious, did not cope well with humiliation. Those who had once feared him now barely acknowledged him. Invitations stopped arriving. His name was removed from donor plaques and forgotten by those who had once benefited from his patronage. He became a relic, a cautionary tale whispered in the halls of aristocratic families. Power built on darkness is never safe from collapse. Rumors began to spread of Lucius's retreat into seclusion. It was said he had started writing a memoir, a personal account of the rise and fall of the Malfoys during the Second Wizarding War. But the manuscript was never published. Some speculated that it was nothing more than parchment soaked in bitterness and regret, filled with half-truths and rationalizations. Others believed Narcissa burned it before it could be finished, unwilling to allow her family's name to be dragged through the ashes once more. In truth, Lucius spent much of his later life in isolation within the walls of his reclaimed manor. He would often sit for hours in the old drawing room, staring into the fireplace where Voldemort once summoned Death Eaters. There, the memory of the Dark Lord loomed like smoke, always present, never vanishing. Lucius, once a master of manipulation, had become a man haunted not just by fear, but by a legacy stained in cowardice. Narcissa bore her exile with quiet dignity. Though she too withdrew from public life, she remained the true pillar of the family. It was she who wrote to Hogwarts arranging for Draco's reintegration. It was she who managed the slow, careful negotiations with the Ministry, ensuring their continued existence. And it was she who shielded Draco from the worst of their disgrace, encouraging him to lead a life unbound by the sins of his father. Draco Malfoy changed. Gone was the boy who once mocked others for their blood. He emerged from the war subdued, no longer a sneering shadow of his parents' ideals. He did not speak much of the past, nor did he attempt to justify it. He focused instead on building a quiet, less volatile life. He married Astoria Greengrass, a woman whose own family had maintained a distance from Voldemort's inner circle. Together they had a son, Scorpius. It was in Scorpius that the Malfoy name found a fragile hope. He was born into a different world, one where Voldemort was a name in a history book and not a man who had once dined in his grandfather's home. Though other children whispered when they learned his surname, Scorpius responded not with anger, but with curiosity. "Is it true," he once asked his father, "that Grandfather Lucius knew Voldemort?" Draco did not lie, but neither did he go into detail. "He did," he said, "and it was the greatest mistake of his life." Over time, the Malfoys moved abroad. They left Britain quietly without ceremony. Some say they settled in the south of France, in a modest estate near the Mediterranean coast. Others claim they lived in Italy under assumed names. What is known is that they rarely returned to Britain, and when they did, it was always under the Ministry's watchful eye. Lucius died in obscurity. No obituary was printed in the Daily Prophet. There was no funeral attended by society's elite. Only a few former allies sent condolences, most of them distant, and laced with formal politeness rather than sincerity. He was buried not in a grand mausoleum, but in a simple grave on the grounds of the Malfoy estate. His tombstone bore only his name and the years of his birth and death. No inscription, no quote, no legacy. Yet even in obscurity, the Malfoy name endured. Scorpius proved to be a bright, kind-hearted child. He did not share his grandfather's obsession with bloodlines or power. When he entered Hogwarts, he was sorted into Slytherin, an echo of family tradition, but quickly gained a reputation for intelligence, wit, and loyalty. His unlikely friendship with Albus Potter, the son of Harry, was seen by many as a symbol of a new era, a bridge between what was and what could be. It was in the cursed child that we saw the full circle begin to close. "Scorpius is the most brilliant of his year," said Professor McGonagall, in a rare moment of admiration. In contrast to Lucius, who sought control through manipulation, Scorpius sought understanding through knowledge. Where Lucius plotted, Scorpius dreamed, and where Lucius feared the future, his grandson embraced it. The tragedy of Lucius Malfoy was not simply in his downfall, but in how he came to embody the futility of blind allegiance. A man who believed he was serving greatness, only to discover that greatness demanded his soul. The legacy he hoped to build through dominance and intimidation collapsed under the weight of truth and consequence. In the end, it was not wealth nor power that preserved the Malfoy name, but humility. Not Lucius, but Draco. Not ambition, but reform. It is easy to forget that behind every villain lies a man who once believed in something, however flawed. Lucius believed in purity, in order, in tradition, and when those ideals were corrupted by evil, he clung to them out of fear rather than conviction. Lucius Malfoy was never a brave man, wrote Rita Skeeter in a post-war exposé. He was clever, calculating, and cultured, but not brave. And yet, perhaps cowardice was his salvation. For when others stood firm in darkness, Lucius fled. And in doing so he lived, but he did not live free. To this day, some witches and wizards refuse to speak of Lucius without venom. Others remember him with a strange sort of pity, a man raised in the wrong time, taught the wrong values, and punished by his own expectations. His story is not one of redemption, but of retreat. A man who stepped back from the abyss, only to find there was no longer a place for him in the world he helped shape. The Malfoy family, as it stands now, is not what it once was. Their fortune diminished, their mansion quieter, their influence faded. But in Scorpius there is a new beginning. A young wizard who smiles more often than he frowns, who reads books rather than curses, and who chooses his friends not by name, but by heart. And so, while Lucius fades into history as a symbol of a darker time, the Malfoy name walks forward, gently, humbly, into the light. Number 16, The Double Game. Was Lucius a spy? From the moment Lucius Malfoy steps onto the pages of the Harry Potter books, he radiates an aura of aristocratic arrogance and cold superiority. Cloaked in expensive robes, cane in hand, with his silver-blonde hair cascading down his shoulders, he is the very picture of the pure-blood elite. A staunch supporter of Voldemort, a man whose presence alone instills discomfort, Lucius appears to be exactly what he claims to be, a loyal Death Eater dedicated to preserving the purity of magical bloodlines. Yet the deeper one dives into the folds of wizarding history, the murkier the picture becomes. There are whispers, fragments of forgotten records in the Ministry of Magic, hints in the pensive memories of war survivors. They all point to one unsettling question. Was Lucius Malfoy playing a double game all along? Throughout the First Wizarding War, Lucius Malfoy operated from the shadows. Unlike other Death Eaters like Bellatrix Lestrange or Barty Crouch Jr., who craved chaos and violence, Lucius moved with careful precision. He rarely engaged directly in battle, preferring instead to use his influence, gold, and connections. When Voldemort fell in 1981, Lucius was one of the few Death Eaters who emerged unscathed. He claimed he had been under the Imperious curse and walked away a free man, while others were dragged to Azkaban in chains. That alone raises questions. But further scrutiny reveals an even more curious pattern. Several unnamed sources within the Department of Magical Law Enforcement later confirmed that Lucius had, during the early years of the war, met privately with at least 2 members of the Wizengamot who were known to oppose Voldemort's ideology. One of them, Lady Selwyn of Northumberland, kept a coded journal in which a recurring entry referred to a silver owl who would bring her information about upcoming Death Eater attacks. The descriptions fit Lucius uncannily well. Another official, the late Cassian Warwick, a deputy under Barty Crouch Sr., was known to have warned the Aura Office of several raids in 1979. Those raids were successfully intercepted, an anomaly, considering how poorly the ministry fared overall during that period. It was only after Warwick's suspicious death in 1982 that these documents began to resurface, sparking fresh debate. Lucius Malfoy's public face was at all times that of a man who embraced power. But power, as those close to him observed, mattered more to him than ideology. The Malfoy family had prospered not by choosing sides, but by choosing survival. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Snape remarks, "Lucius is in trouble, noting that Voldemort was displeased with him. The question remains, was Lucius truly incompetent, or had he withheld something important from the Dark Lord? Was his so-called failure at the Department of Mysteries merely a blunder or a deliberate move to undermine the very cause he claimed to serve? It is curious that Lucius, who so proudly donated to causes like the Committee for the Disposal of Dangerous Creatures and pushed anti-Muggle legislation, never directly committed any crime that could be definitively proven in court. Others had been convicted on lesser suspicions. Yet Lucius seemed to have an uncanny ability to elude retribution. Dolores Umbridge, who was known for her zeal in punishing so-called traitors to the blood, held a respectful, if wary, attitude toward Lucius. Her private correspondence, obtained through a ministry leak in 2003, reveals her suspicion. Malfoy plays too many games, even for my taste. He smiles too readily for a man who should be grovelling. One of the most telling examples of Lucius's ambiguous allegiance came in 1980 during a secret meeting held at Malfoy Manor. According to a suppressed report unearthed decades later, a senior unspeakable by the name of Thelonious Greaves met with Lucius under the guise of negotiating artifact preservation laws. The meeting, however, concluded with Greaves walking away with a detailed list of dark object caches hidden across Wiltshire, information that later led to the destruction of a major Death Eater weapon stockpile. It was dismissed at the time as coincidence, but Greaves' personal notes, found in a sealed vault years after his retirement, recorded, "He fears Voldemort's recklessness. I believe he would rather preserve his bloodline than sacrifice it to the Dark Lord's madness." Even after Voldemort's first fall, Lucius remained strategically silent. He didn't celebrate, but neither did he mourn. While others in the pure blood community retreated, Lucius took up positions of influence, most notably a seat on the Hogwarts Board of Governors. It was from this vantage point that he orchestrated the placement of Tom Riddle's diary into the hands of Ginny Weasley. Many have interpreted this as a loyal attempt to resurrect the Dark Lord, but there's another possibility. The diary was a Horcrux, a piece of Voldemort's very soul. Would a truly loyal servant risk losing such a sacred object? Or was Lucius attempting to dispose of it before others discovered what it truly was? In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Dumbledore tells Harry, "You will find that I will only truly have left this school when none here are loyal to me." It is striking that Lucius, despite his open disdain for Dumbledore, never made a direct move against him until the diary incident. Perhaps he feared Dumbledore more than he feared Voldemort. Or perhaps, like many skilled political players, he sought to remain on both sides until the winds of power shifted decisively. After all, the diary incident, if successful, would have destabilized the school, not destroyed it. Chaos without commitment. His actions during the Second Wizarding War also provide fertile ground for speculation. Despite Voldemort's return, Lucius displayed none of the zeal shown by others like Fenrir Greyback or the Carrows. He was cautious, withdrawn, and increasingly anxious. His failure at the ministry, which led to his imprisonment in Azkaban, may have been staged or even deliberately mishandled. Some magical historians have posited that Lucius deliberately sabotaged the mission in order to alert the Order of the Phoenix. The timing of the operation, the presence of so many Death Eaters in one location, and the lack of any meaningful gain all suggest something was amiss. Narcissa Malfoy's actions during the Battle of Hogwarts are often cited as evidence that the family's loyalty was always to themselves. She lied to Voldemort about Harry's death to protect her son, but this act cannot be viewed in isolation. Lucius had by then already retreated into passivity. He was present during the final confrontation, but did not fight. He did not raise his wand. His silence was louder than any spell. It was the silence of a man who had lost faith, or perhaps never had it to begin with. What complicates the narrative even further are the reports that surfaced years after the war, buried deep within the restricted section of the Department of Magical History. These documents suggest that Lucius had once offered to collaborate with certain auras in exchange for leniency. While Kingsley Shacklebolt has never confirmed this, a redacted memo signed by him reads, M may have been useful, cooperation not confirmed, motivated by self-preservation. The identity of M has never been clarified, but many believe it refers to Malfoy. It is also worth noting that Lucius was never branded with the same level of hatred that followed other Death Eaters. His name did not appear on wanted posters during the war. He was not hunted like Dolohov or Mulciber, and once peace was restored, he was allowed to keep his fortune, his manor, and his title. Some say it was political pragmatism. Others believe he provided something of immense value to the ministry, something that remains classified to this day. Even Severus Snape, a man who lived by deception, seemed to hold a curious respect for Lucius. In The Half-Blood Prince, Snape tells Narcissa, "Your sister doubts me. Perhaps she's right to. I have deceived the Dark Lord before." That single line, buried in a room filled with secrets, suggests that deception was more common among Voldemort's circle than previously acknowledged. Snape was not alone. Lucius, too, may have walked that knife's edge between betrayal and loyalty. Then there's the curious matter of the Malfoy family's ancient vault in Gringotts. Rumours among goblin circles tell of an object hidden during the First War, an object of immense magical value that the family refused to surrender, even to Voldemort. No one knows what it was, but legends whisper of a book once belonging to Salazar Slytherin, bound in basilisk leather. If Lucius did indeed possess such a relic, keeping it from Voldemort would have been nothing short of treason. In the end, the truth about Lucius Malfoy may never be known. He has given no interviews, published no memoirs. He lives quietly now, rarely seen outside his estate. But in the quiet halls of magical academia, the question lingers like a shadow in the corner of every discussion about the war. Did Lucius Malfoy serve two masters? Was his loyalty ever real? Or was he simply a man with no country, choosing sides only long enough to ensure the survival of his name, his wealth, and above all, his bloodline? Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is not that Lucius was a hero in disguise, but that he was exactly what he appeared to be, a man who believed in nothing but power. For in a world torn between good and evil, there is something far more dangerous than a villain. It is the opportunist who serves no truth but his own. And Lucius Malfoy, for all his elegance, may have been the most dangerous kind of wizard, the one who watches, waits, and survives. Number 17, The Malfoys and the Curse of Blood. The Malfoy name shone like polished silver in the halls of the wizarding elite, proud, immaculate, and untouched by the stain of Muggle blood. But beneath the glinting facade of wealth and lineage lay a deeper, more troubling legacy, one not often discussed aloud, even among the pure-blood inner circles. The Malfoys, like many noble wizarding families, had paid the price of their exclusivity, not in gold or political standing, but in blood itself. The term blood curse, or sanguinem maledictio, was whispered among pure-blood scholars, often in tones reserved for dark magic or unhealable afflictions. The notion referred not to a single hex, but to the long-term toll of generations of insular marriage, where lineage mattered more than love. For the Malfoys, who prided themselves on centuries of uncontaminated blood, the consequences were subtle but unmistakable. Records in the restricted section of the Hogwarts library make cryptic mention of Calius Malfoy, the great-great-grandfather of Lucius, whose brilliance in enchantment was rivaled only by his descent into madness. Descriptions of Calius's final days read like passages from a Gothic novel, visions, mutterings, and ultimately the immolation of his own estate in Wiltshire. It is said he became convinced that his wife was a shape-shifting banshee sent to steal his soul. She died in the fire, along with two servants. Calius perished in the drawing-room, surrounded by ancient family portraits that melted with him. A decade earlier, Augustus Malfoy, a cousin of Calius, had vanished without warning. The only trace left behind was his bedroom mirror, found smeared with his own blood from the inside. Some speculated self-harm, others suspected a failed ritual. The truth was never known. The mirror was removed by the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, and to this day is locked away in the department's most secure vault. Some say it whispers. Lucius Malfoy was born into this legacy, cloaked in elegance and status, but not untouched by its hidden currents. His childhood was marked by discipline and privilege, but also by the strange silences that blanketed the manor after dusk. He was told to avoid the west wing of the house, never to touch the oil painting of Cassia Malfoy, who had died in grief after the death of her infant son. But if one looked closely, the child's portrait was missing. Some claimed it had been painted over after the baby began appearing in dreams. Despite all this, Lucius grew to be composed, refined, and charismatic, a man who embodied control. He married Narcissa Black, herself a descendant of similar bloodlines. Their union was less a marriage than a merger, two pure-blood houses entwining their power, preserving what they believed was magical superiority. But even Lucius, polished as he appeared, bore the marks of inherited shadows. Several former Hogwarts classmates recalled incidents that betrayed something beneath the calm. One memory resurfaced often. In his 5th year, when a visiting Muggle-born scholar was granted access to the library for a special lecture, Lucius flew into such a quiet rage that Madame Pince had to physically restrain him. He left scorch marks on 2 books, hexed a suit of armor to smash the boy's inkwell, and was later found in the dungeons, sobbing quietly. He never spoke of it again. Those close to the family described Lucius as deeply devoted to his wife and son. But it was precisely this devotion that revealed his more dangerous side. When threats touched Draco, Lucius unraveled. During the Chamber of Secrets debacle, it was Lucius who manipulated events to have Dumbledore suspended. When that failed, he cornered Harry Potter with trembling hands and eyes that flickered too quickly, an expression not of strategic fury, but of near hysteria. Even Dobby sensed it, whispering later that Master was not himself. During the Second Wizarding War, his dissent became impossible to ignore. Stripped of power, publicly humiliated, Lucius was no longer the proud patriarch, but a man hunted by both sides. "My father's no coward," Draco once snapped, but the truth was more complicated. Lucius was afraid, terrified, and that terror unlocked something primal in him. When Voldemort took over Malfoy Manor, Lucius didn't fight. He trembled. He obeyed. He watched as others were tortured in his dining room and did nothing. This collapse was not merely political, it was psychological. One auror noted in his trial report, Mr. Malfoy displayed all signs of emotional dissociation. When questioned about the events in his own home, he referred to them in the third person, as if he hadn't been present. Another ministry psychologist described him as a man fractured by fear, held together only by habit. And yet, even in his broken state, Lucius clung to appearances. He maintained daily rituals, polished shoes, manicured nails, the same cologne he'd worn for 30 years. It was as though he believed that if he looked like a Malfoy, he might still be one. But Narcissa knew better. In private, she took over decisions, protected Draco from further shame, and treated her husband with the kind of soft pity one might offer an aging dog. It was not the first time the Malfoy men had collapsed under pressure. An ancestor named Armand Malfoy, who had aided William the Conqueror and was granted land for his services, had reportedly killed himself after a prophecy warned his bloodline would end in disgrace. The prophecy did not come true, at least not yet, but Armand's journals hint at a line unspooling at the seams. The ministry has quietly investigated ancestral magical instabilities in several pure-blood families. Healers at St. Mungo's now confirm that certain traits, emotional volatility, obsessive perfectionism, and episodes of psychomagical dissociation appear more frequently in interrelated wizarding lines. The Malfoys, the Blacks, the Lestranges all shared not only vaults but ailments. Lucius, of course, denied such things. In his few public statements after the war, he was careful, aloof. "We serve the wizarding world in our own way," he said to the prophet once. But even then his voice lacked the iron certainty it once had. Rita Skeeter described it best. He spoke as though afraid someone might scream at him from the shadows. What the world never saw were the nights Lucius spent pacing the manor, checking doors, muttering protective charms that hadn't worked in decades. Narcissa once found him asleep in Draco's childhood bed, clutching the boy's first wand like a talisman. Draco, by then, had moved out. "Father's not well," he said once, carefully. "But he won't let go of the past. It's all he has." In one private letter to an old friend found after his death, Lucius wrote, "I wonder sometimes whether we are merely relics of a long-failed spell, passed from hand to hand like cursed objects. We shine, yes, but shine like poisoned silver." Was this the blood curse? Not a single explosive moment, but a slow corrosion of the soul. A lineage so obsessed with remaining intact that it withered from within. Even the house itself seemed to participate in the decay. Visitors to Malfoy Manor spoke of walls that echoed footsteps twice, of portraits whose eyes didn't blink but watched. A nanny once resigned after seeing a child's handprint on the inside of a mirror in Draco's room. Draco had been at Hogwarts for weeks. The Malfoy family survived the war, but not untouched. Lucius lived long enough to see his grandson born, Scorpius, bright-eyed and curious, and in that child some saw hope. "He's nothing like Lucius," said one Hogwarts professor. "He asked questions, he laughs." But even so, some wondered if the blood remembered. In the end, Lucius became a ghost within his own legacy. A man who had everything and who lost it not because of Voldemort or Dumbledore or even Harry Potter, but because the curse of his own bloodline had hollowed him out long before the first spell was cast. There's a passage in The Half-Blood Prince where Dumbledore says, "Perhaps those who are best suited to power are those who have never sought it." Lucius Malfoy, who sought it with every fibre of his being, found only shadows. His tragedy wasn't that he fell, but that he was always falling, even when he stood tall. And so the Malfoys remain, not broken, but brittle, not extinct, but endangered. The bloodline continues, yes, but not without the ghosts that walk its halls, whispering of things lost, things hidden, and the price of purity pursued too far. Number 18. Servant or victim of the system? Lucius Malfoy was born into a world carved from marble, cold, noble, and immovable. The gilded halls of Malfoy Manor echoed with centuries of pride and privilege. From his earliest memories, Lucius was taught that blood was destiny. His father, Abraxas Malfoy, instilled in him a relentless devotion to family legacy. The young boy wandered the estate not as a free soul, but as a future torchbearer of tradition. He did not choose this path. It was carved for him long before his birth. Every tapestry, every echo of their ancestors' whispers reminded him, "You are a Malfoy, and that means something." He grew up learning the value of secrecy, control, and calculated influence. But in this inheritance of power, he also inherited chains. When Lucius arrived at Hogwarts, he was already marked, not by a dark mark, but by centuries of belief in purity. He wore his Slytherin colours not as school pride, but as an emblem of blood superiority. At 12, he looked down upon Muggle-borns with the same contempt his father had shown. But behind the sneers and polished shoes, there was a boy desperate to be who the world expected him to be. He memorized the rules of the old world like scripture, desperate not to falter. He wasn't cruel for pleasure. He was cruel because cruelty had been labelled as strength. Lucius didn't fall into Voldemort's ranks out of malice. He joined the Death Eaters because the Dark Lord offered preservation. The pure-blood ideology Voldemort preached echoed the lullabies Lucius had heard in his crib. To him, Voldemort was a safeguard against chaos, a promise that the old order would not fade. When he handed Tom Riddle's diary to Ginny Weasley, he wasn't just furthering a scheme, he was trying to return the world to a version he understood. He underestimated the consequences, blinded by the illusion that he was still in control. But from that moment on, the cracks began to show. The diary incident marked the beginning of Lucius's unraveling. The loss of influence at the ministry, his dismissal from the school board, it was more than public disgrace. It was the first time the system he believed in failed to protect him. He had always believed that power and name would shield him. But the winds were changing, Dumbledore's growing influence, the rise of Muggleborns in positions of power, and the resistance of families like the Weasleys, all of it was an assault on the Malfoy world. For Lucius, it was like watching a painting being smeared. He did not see progress, he saw desecration. His decision to return to Voldemort during the Second Wizarding War was not fueled by ambition, but by desperation. Lucius had spent a lifetime believing that influence was won through alliances, not ideals. He failed to see that Voldemort did not value loyalty, only usefulness, and Lucius, now wounded and diminished, had become dispensable. Still he tried to serve, hosting Death Eaters at Malfoy Manor, handing over his home as a sanctuary for darkness, but the cost was evident in his eyes. The grandeur of the manor became a prison, each marble column a reminder of what was slipping through his fingers. By the time Voldemort had truly returned, Lucius was already broken. The incident at the Department of Mysteries, where he led the Death Eaters against a group of teenagers, exposed his fragility. He lost not just the prophecy that Voldemort craved, but his remaining dignity. "The Dark Lord is displeased," Bellatrix Lestrange had hissed, and Lucius's shoulders had sunk beneath his fine robes. He had become a pawn, not a player. And yet he still clung to his identity like a man gasping for air. Throughout it all, Lucius failed to understand that the world was no longer a place that respected his values. He looked at Hermione Granger and saw not brilliance, but defiance. A Muggle-born witch who outperformed his own son, who earned the respect he believed only lineage could grant. He looked at Arthur Weasley and saw not integrity but intrusion, a man who, despite his modest means, held more moral authority than Lucius ever had. And when he looked at Harry Potter, he did not see a child but a symbol of the future, a future that had no place for him. Draco, his only son, became both his pride and his failure. Lucius wanted him to carry the Malfoy name with dignity, to restore their status. But Draco, dragged into the war, burdened by expectations, began to unravel under the same weight Lucius had carried all his life. The moment Draco stood, wand shaking, unable to kill Dumbledore, was the moment Lucius saw the mirror. His son was not a killer, neither was he, and that terrified him. The system they lived by demanded blood, but neither Malfoy could deliver. Narcissa's decision to lie to Voldemort about Harry's death was not just an act of maternal love, it was rebellion, a quiet, dignified rebellion that Lucius never dared to attempt himself. She chose her family over ideology. Lucius followed. At the Battle of Hogwarts, the Malfoys did not fight. They searched for Draco. And in that silent choice to walk away rather than stand for either side, Lucius confessed without words that he had lost. The pure-blood ideology, the power he once wielded, the name he cherished, all of it meant nothing now. By the end of the war, Lucius Malfoy was not a villain. He was a ghost of a fallen era. The Ministry, though victorious, did not imprison him again. Perhaps they saw that punishment had already been delivered. His pride was shattered, his family in ruins, his home tainted by war. He no longer walked with the arrogance of a pure-blood heir. He sat quietly, aged beyond his years, watching the world he could no longer control rebuild without him. What makes Lucius Malfoy a tragic figure is not his allegiance to darkness, but his inability to adapt. Unlike Severus Snape, who redefined himself through sacrifice, or even Regulus Black, who died to redeem his soul, Lucius clung to a crumbling past. He feared change more than death, and in doing so, he let the tides wash over him. He never understood that strength lies in growth, not preservation, that heritage means nothing if it doesn't evolve. In the end, Lucius was not the architect of evil. He was its relic. The Malfoys' survival post-war was not a triumph, but a hollow continuation. Draco, marked by fear and trauma, walked away from the path his father had carved. He married Astoria Greengrass, a woman who, though also of pure blood, believed in raising their child Scorpius without prejudice. Lucius could not understand this choice. He saw it as a dilution, but perhaps deep down he envied it, the freedom to choose. When the quote from the Deathly Hallows reads, "Draco, Draco, you must do it," as Lucius pleads with his son to kill Dumbledore, it is not the voice of a monster, it is the voice of a man whose world is crashing. He is not demanding blood, he is begging his son to save them, to win back favor, to survive. It is the most human he has ever been. The tragedy of Lucius Malfoy is not that he was evil. It is that he believed in a world that never truly existed. The superiority of blood, the invincibility of wealth, the permanence of power, these were illusions. And when reality shattered them, Lucius had nothing left. He had spent his life playing a game whose rules were written in lies. To examine Lucius as only a villain is to ignore the complexity of his character. He was shaped by forces older than himself. Raised in a house that worshipped control, he never learned compassion. He mistook fear for respect, obedience for loyalty. And in the end he watched as those around him, his wife, his son, even his enemies, chose love, sacrifice, and courage, while he remained frozen. Lucius Malfoy is not a hero, but he is a reminder that when systems become chains, those born into them suffer alongside those they oppress, that fear of change can turn even the proudest into prisoners, and that sometimes the hardest battle is not against others, but against the past we refuse to let go. His fall was not spectacular, it was quiet, slow, inevitable. The world moved on, and Lucius Malfoy, heir of privilege, servant of tradition, and victim of a system he did not create, sat in silence, surrounded by ruins of belief. His was not a redemption arc, but a cautionary tale, not of how far evil can go, but how far a man can fall when he cannot change. Why weren't the Malfoys killed by Voldemort? Lucius Malfoy had always walked a dangerous line, gilded by his wealth and pure blood legacy, but constantly threatened by the forces he thought he controlled. When Lord Voldemort returned to power, many expected Lucius to rise, to reclaim his place as a trusted lieutenant in the Dark Lord's new regime. But the truth was more complex. Lucius fell from grace, stumbled, and failed, yet he and his family were not killed. This fact, baffling to those who knew the mercilessness of Voldemort, remains one of the strangest anomalies of the Second Wizarding War. Voldemort, whose reputation for swift and brutal retribution was legendary, did not forgive failure. Just ask Avery, who was tortured for giving the wrong information. Or Rookwood, who was imprisoned for years and then mistrusted even after escape. Even minor missteps were met with rage, the Cruciatus Curse, or death. But Lucius committed no small error. He lost the prophecy in the Department of Mysteries, an object Voldemort had sought for months, and yet he lived. Why? To understand this, one must go beyond the public face of Lucius Malfoy, the sneering aristocrat, the disdainful voice in the Ministry, the man who threatened Harry Potter with a curse at 12 years old. The deeper truth lies in the dynamic within his family, and in how Voldemort, for all his power, made choices rooted in fear as much as dominance. Voldemort did not destroy the Malfoys because they were more valuable broken than dead. They served a purpose in their shame. After the Battle of the Department of Mysteries, Lucius was imprisoned in Azkaban. This alone could have marked his end. Many Death Eaters never returned from Azkaban. They were either left to rot or executed in secret by orders within Voldemort's inner circle, but Lucius was rescued during the mass breakout in 1996. Still, his return did not restore him. Voldemort did not embrace him. He used him. Stripped of his wand, humiliated in his own home, Lucius became a symbol, not of power, but of caution. The Malfoy Manor, once a fortress of privilege, became Voldemort's headquarters. Lucius no longer ruled his house. It was invaded by a parasite he could not fight. The once proud man was reduced to silence, forced to watch as Voldemort used his drawing room to torture Charity Burbage, the Muggle Studies professor, in front of his son and wife. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, the narration is clear. Lucius looked beside himself with anxiety and fear. Draco, too, had failed. Tasked with killing Albus Dumbledore, a nearly impossible mission, he hesitated. He could not perform the act. Severus Snape stepped in, fulfilling the unbreakable vow he made to Narcissa. In the eyes of Voldemort, this should have been another death sentence. Draco's failure was not only personal, it was political. But he was not punished. He was kept alive, dragged deeper into Voldemort's shadow, used as a pawn to keep Lucius and Narcissa compliant. And then there was Narcissa, the quiet figure at the edge of the battlefield. She never bore the dark mark. She never openly defied Voldemort, but neither did she ever kneel the way Bellatrix did. Narcissa's role in the survival of the Malfoy family cannot be overstated. Her diplomacy, her silence, her ability to read the room. These were her weapons. She used them with surgical precision. When she approached Snape in Half-Blood Prince, begging him to protect Draco, it was not only an act of desperation, it was calculation. She knew who Snape was to Voldemort, a favored asset, a useful spy, and she leveraged her fear into something useful. She invoked the sacred magic of the unbreakable vow, binding Snape to Draco's survival. In that moment, she planted the first seed of her family's safety. But her greatest act of defiance, and her most brilliant one, came in the Forbidden Forest. Harry Potter had just been struck down by Voldemort. As the boy lay on the ground, motionless, Voldemort demanded confirmation of his death. It was Narcissa Malfoy who stepped forward to check. But instead of declaring Harry dead, she whispered a question that would change the course of the war. "Is Draco alive?" Harry, barely conscious, answered yes. And Narcissa, in a moment of courage laced with maternal instinct, lied to the Dark Lord. She told him Harry was dead. This single act, a whispered lie, saved Harry, ensured Voldemort's arrogance, and preserved her family. In her own way, Narcissa won the war. The decision not to punish her for this, especially when Voldemort discovered the truth later, is revealing. It suggests that Voldemort suspected something, but chose to ignore it. Perhaps he feared the consequences. By this time, Voldemort was losing control. The Elder Wand was not working as expected. The Horcruxes were being destroyed. He could feel his grip slipping. To alienate or execute the Malfoys, especially after Lucius had returned his wand and Narcissa had delivered the boy who lived dead, may have felt like an unnecessary risk. Moreover, Voldemort saw value in control through humiliation. He did not need to kill Lucius, he had already broken him. Lucius no longer walked with pride. He trembled, he flinched. Voldemort enjoyed this more than death. He could parade Lucius around as an example of what failure led to. The message was clearer this way, but Voldemort also understood hierarchy. Killing Malfoy would not have rallied his followers, it would have frightened them. The Malfoys were old blood, respected even among Death Eaters. If Voldemort destroyed them, others might question whether any loyalty could ever be enough. By keeping them close, disgraced but breathing, he reminded his followers of both mercy and domination, a twisted form of psychological warfare. There is another possibility, one rooted in Voldemort's own paranoia. By the final year of the war, Voldemort was no longer thinking clearly. He saw betrayal everywhere. He no longer fully trusted anyone, not Snape, not even Nagini. In such a state, enemies were everywhere. But Narcissa, she was quiet. She asked nothing. She did not command, she was beneath notice. Sometimes those who keep their heads down survive. In the end, the Malfoys survived the war, not because they were powerful, but because they were powerless. Voldemort viewed them as broken. And broken things are not threats. He could not see how dangerous a mother's love could be. He underestimated the cunning of Narcissa, the quiet desperation of Lucius, and the fear-driven obedience of Draco. And that underestimation was fatal. In the Great Hall, after the final battle, the Malfoys did not join the other Death Eaters. They did not fight for Voldemort. They searched for Draco. In Deathly Hallows, J.K. Rowling writes, "None of the Malfoys fought. They had slipped away into the shadows and reappeared only when it was clear that Voldemort was dead." This was not cowardice, it was strategy. They had learned that survival was not in victory, but in retreat. Rowling once said in an interview that the Malfoys were left alive because they abandoned Voldemort at the end, that their love for each other triumphed over ideology. It is one of the rare cases in her universe where redemption does not come from a change of heart, but from a shift in priority. They did not suddenly believe in good, they simply stopped believing in Voldemort. So the question, why did Voldemort not kill them, has a layered answer. He didn't kill them because he didn't need to, because fear was a more useful tool than death, because Narcissa was too clever, because killing Lucius would have broken more than bones. It might have shattered the fragile balance of power Voldemort barely held together in his final days. Lucius Malfoy survived not because he succeeded, but because he failed so completely that he ceased to matter. Voldemort was not in the business of killing irrelevance. Narcissa survived because she played her cards with exquisite precision, revealing nothing, saying little, always protecting her son. And Draco survived because, in the end, he was a frightened boy, not a killer. His hesitation on the astronomy tower revealed the truth. He was never truly Voldemort's. Their survival is not a tale of mercy. It is a tale of strategy, fear, and the quiet resistance of a mother's love. Number 20. Lucius in books versus films, contrast and misrepresentation. Of all the characters who tread the shadowy border between villain and victim in the Harry Potter universe, few are as tragically misunderstood as Lucius Malfoy. For many readers and viewers, his name conjures an image of sneering arrogance, an aristocrat with ice-blonde hair and a serpent-headed cane, a Death Eater whose loyalty to Voldemort seemed unshakable, until it wasn't. Yet those who have walked the corridors of Hogwarts through J.K. Rowling's prose know that the Lucius of the books is not merely a villain dressed in fine robes. He is a portrait of fear draped in privilege, a man who gambled everything on a crumbling ideology, and who, in the end, paid dearly not just with his freedom, but with the legacy he hoped to pass on to his son. The films, in their brilliance, often chose clarity over complexity, streamlining characters into visual symbols. Lucius became one such symbol, a personification of pure-blood supremacy and cruel elitism. Jason Isaacs, who portrayed him on screen, leaned into that image with deliberate flair. The Lucius of the films rarely hesitated. His threats were sharp, his presence menacing, his expression a mixture of disdain and hunger for power. But this version of Lucius, while captivating, stripped away the very layers that made his character such a potent commentary on societal decay and personal ruin. In the books, Lucius Malfoy is more than a Death Eater. He is the scion of an ancient house, burdened by expectations and the weight of ancestral pride. His actions, from slipping Tom Riddle's diaries into the hands of an 11-year-old girl to lobbying for ministry influence, are not merely those of a malicious man, but of one desperately trying to protect the status quo. The quote, "You mark my words, their parents will hear about this," from Chamber of Secrets might seem like nothing more than pompous posturing, but beneath it lies the voice of someone who has always believed that power comes from association, reputation, and fear. Lucius's true terror begins when Voldemort returns, not when the Dark Lord is a whisper or a memory, but when he steps into the Malfoy Manor and turns it into his personal base of operations. Here, Lucius is no longer in control. The house that once symbolized his dominance becomes a prison of obedience. In Deathly Hallows, when Voldemort uses Lucius's wand and it breaks, the symbolism is loud and cruel. Lucius is disarmed, not just literally, but socially and spiritually. His identity begins to erode, and the pride he once wore like armor becomes a shackle. Perhaps the most haunting transformation is not in how Lucius looks, but how he behaves. In Half-Blood Prince, he is conspicuously absent. Jailed in Azkaban, he loses everything he once used to shield himself. His wealth cannot protect him. his name offers no sanctuary, and his alliances crumble. By Deathly Hallows he is a shell of the man he was, pacing the manor's halls while his wife, Narcissa, takes on the quiet strength to protect their son. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione are captured and brought to Malfoy Manor, Lucius's fear is palpable. He begs Voldemort for mercy, clinging to the last scraps of his crumbling status. This vulnerability is what makes the literary Lucius so compelling. He's not evil in the way that Bellatrix Lestrange is evil. He does not revel in chaos or worship destruction. He is a man taught to believe in blood, in order, in legacy, and when those constructs fail him, he has no tools left to navigate the world. The way he constantly glances at Draco, the concern in his eyes when Voldemort demands obedience, these are the signs of a man caught between ideologies and instinct. In the final battle, Lucius does not fight. He does not defend the school or attack Harry. He searches for his son in the ruins, and when he finds him, he flees with his family. The war is over, and Lucius has nothing left to defend. The films, for all their visual splendor, rarely allow for this nuance. Jason Isaacs once admitted in interviews that he based Lucius on those who've had unchecked power their whole lives, who never needed to question their place in the world. And while this portrayal serves the visual narrative well, it flattens Lucius into something close to caricature. His desperation, his moral decline, his eventual irrelevance, these are shadows in the background, rarely explored in depth. His fear is present, but stylized, his downfall more aesthetic than emotional. In Order of the Phoenix, the book shows us Lucius as the leader of the Death Eaters at the Department of Mysteries. He is dangerous, yes, but still calculating, still concerned with outcomes. When the prophecy smashes and he realizes what he's lost, he doesn't scream or rage. He is silent because he knows the consequences are already spiraling. In contrast, the film heightens the theatrics. He is more dramatic, more overtly villainous. What is lost in this adaptation is subtlety, the slow, suffocating fear of a man who knows the ground beneath him is giving way. One of the most revealing moments in the books comes not during battle, but in the quiet decisions. Lucius's silence when Narcissa lies to Voldemort about Harry's death is deafening. He doesn't interrupt. He doesn't object. Perhaps he realizes at last that survival matters more than allegiance. Perhaps he sees in his wife's trembling voice the last chance to save what's left of their family. This moment never truly arrives in the same way on screen. Narcissa's act remains, but Lucius's internal collapse is less visible. His silence is treated as cowardice, not consequence. What makes the book's portrayal so tragic is that Lucius is not granted redemption, only realization. He does not fight for good, he does not stand with the Order, he simply falls out of the story, his relevance drained. And that is the punishment the wizarding world gives him, not death, not imprisonment, but irrelevance. His place in the new world is undefined, his power is gone. The wizarding elite has no room for failures, and Lucius becomes the most pitiful kind, a man who followed all the rules of his broken world and still ended up with nothing. There is a scene in Goblet of Fire that captures Lucius's complexity better than any speech. When he sees Arthur Weasley at the Quidditch World Cup, the exchange is biting. The rivalry is not just political, it's ideological. Lucius scoffs at Arthur's humble robes and big family, but the insecurity is thinly veiled. Lucius has money and power, but Arthur has integrity, love, and respect. Lucius knows it, and he hates it. This dynamic is only touched upon in the films, where Lucius's contempt is shown, but his jealousy is left to interpretation. It is also worth noting how Lucius treats Dobby in the books. While certainly cruel, the relationship is more than just a power play. Dobby represents the contradiction at the heart of Lucius's world, an obedient servant who becomes a symbol of rebellion. When Dobby is freed, Lucius attempts to curse Harry, but is stopped. His rage is not just at Harry, it is at the collapse of a system that has protected him for generations. In that one act, a boy disrupted centuries of tradition, and Lucius has no words to respond. Even in his interactions with Draco, the books offer glimpses of something deeper. Lucius is not a kind father, but he is a father shaped by expectation. He pushes Draco not out of malice but fear that his son will not survive unless he conforms. When Draco fails to kill Dumbledore and the task falls to Severus Snape, Lucius does not gloat, he does not berate. He disappears from the forefront, and the silence speaks volumes. He is losing his son to a world he no longer understands. The ultimate tragedy of Lucius Malfoy is not that he was evil, it is that he was weak. Not physically, not intellectually, but spiritually. He placed his faith in legacy and it betrayed him. He wrapped himself in wealth and tradition only to discover they could not save him. His choices were guided not by hatred, but by terror. Terror of change, of losing status, of being forgotten. And in the end he becomes a ghost among the living, wandering through the pages as a warning. J.K. Rowling crafted Lucius with restraint. She never asked readers to forgive him, but she did ask us to understand him, to see the man behind the mask, the man who never realized his mask was rotting. And that understanding makes Lucius one of the most human villains in the series. His fall is not a triumph of good over evil. It is the slow collapse of someone who tried to serve two masters, fear and family. And he failed both. Even the epilogue of Deathly Hallows omits him. Draco is seen with his son, Scorpius, alone. Lucius is not mentioned. Is he dead, disgraced, retired to the shadows of the manor he once ruled? We don't know, and that absence is louder than any scene. It tells us that Lucius has become irrelevant, a relic of a war-torn world, unable to adapt, unfit for the future. In the end, the comparison between book and film Lucius is not about right or wrong, it's about depth. The films showed us a villain, the books showed us a man, and that man, for all his sins, for all his cowardice, leaves behind more than just hatred. He leaves a cautionary tale, a reminder that sometimes the scariest fate is not death or defeat. It's becoming obsolete. Number 21, The Cane with a Secret. What was Lucius hiding? Lucius Malfoy's cane was more than a symbol of aristocratic pride. It was a legacy forged in secrecy, pride, and fear. Anyone who ever saw him stride through the halls of the Ministry of Magic or down the polished corridors of Malfoy Manor would recall that cane. Polished black wood, topped with a gleaming silver serpent's head. Its eyes were twin emeralds that seemed to watch and judge in silence. To the untrained eye, it was a fashionable item befitting a man of his stature. But those who knew the darker paths of magic understood. Lucius Malfoy never carried anything without a purpose. Beneath the serpent's mouth lay a mechanism, intricate and ancient, releasing the wand hidden within. Crafted of yew with a dragon heartstring core, the wand was 16 inches long, Lucius's faithful tool for incantations, curses, and control. This wand had seen the rise of the Dark Lord, and it had witnessed his fall. But the cane itself had a deeper story, one whispered in the darker corners of wizarding society. The wand was only the surface. The cane, it was said, carried enchantments older than the ministry itself. Among the most persistent rumors was that the Malfoy cane, passed down from generation to generation, bore a protective charm rooted in ancient magical bloodlines. Specifically, the artifact was believed to contain a fragment of a charm against legilimency. Few dared confirm this, for even to ask was to invite suspicion. But those who knew of the cane's secrets claimed that it shielded Lucius from the mental invasions of wizards far more skilled than him in the art of reading minds. Legilimency was no idle concern for a man like Lucius. He lived in a world where alliances were built on deception and betrayal. To reveal one's thoughts, even by accident, was to risk death or disgrace. The magical community whispered of an incident during the First Wizarding War, when Lucius had faced interrogation by Alastor Moody himself. Despite Moody's relentless glare and expertise in mind-reading, he came away frustrated, unable to pierce Lucius's mind. The official record declared Lucius innocent. The reality? The cane had done its job. There was more. Beneath the serpent's mouth, nestled in the polished wood, lay a hidden compartment. Its existence was known only to Lucius and possibly his late father, Abraxas Malfoy. What lay within that compartment was a matter of legend. Some claimed it held a bezoar for emergency poisoning attempts. Others whispered of a lock of Narcissa's hair, enchanted to bring clarity of thought. But the most persistent and emotional version claimed that it held a letter, a personal, final note from Abraxas Malfoy to his son, written in the months before dragonpox took him. This letter, written in spidery, fading ink, was rumoured to hold not just a father's farewell, but the final secrets of the Malfoy legacy, family enemies, old debts, and even the names of those who once swore blood oaths to the Malfoy name. Lucius never spoke of it, not even to Narcissa. He would often touch the cane absent-mindedly in moments of stress, during Dumbledore's visits, in courtrooms, or when meeting Severus Snape. It was not affection for the cane, it was protection, memory, and burden. The cane's power extended beyond what most could comprehend. In 1994, during the Quidditch World Cup, Lucius carried it as he paraded through the minister's VIP box. Though outwardly composed, he gripped the serpent's head tighter when Harry Potter appeared. The wand within could be drawn in a flash, but it was the cane's shielding aura that protected Lucius from accidental revelations. At the time, Dumbledore was seated just a row away. Lucius knew better than to underestimate the man's gaze. During the events at the Department of Mysteries in 1996, Lucius was at the forefront of Voldemort's inner circle. When he led the assault against Harry and the Order, he carried the cane as always. Bellatrix Lestrange, wild and laughing, mocked him for holding on to symbols of wealth in the middle of battle. But Lucius knew it was more than a symbol. Even in chaos, he refused to leave behind the last relic of his bloodline's wisdom. He lost the duel that night, but not before the cane had done its duty, blocking a mental intrusion by Kingsley Shacklebolt that could have unravelled the entire plan. After the failure at the Department of Mysteries, Lucius was imprisoned in Azkaban. The Ministry, under pressure from public opinion and the rising resistance, confiscated all of his possessions. The cane was among the first to be taken. Rumours swirled through the Aura office that Arthur Weasley, with a rare grimace of satisfaction, oversaw its initial seizure. The artifact was sent to the Department of Magical Artifacts for disassembly and examination. It was never returned. "Lucius Malfoy's wand was taken from him by Lord Voldemort," said Ollivander, under duress, "in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows." But the wand was only half of the story. The cane had already been stripped from him by the Ministry, a deeper humiliation for a man who saw himself as the embodiment of old magic. Without it, he became unmoored. His composure slipped, his posture crumbled. The cane had given him more than balance. It had given him certainty. What became of the cane remains a mystery. Official records state that the wand was separated and returned to Ollivander's collection post-war. The cane, however, vanished within the depths of bureaucracy. One persistent rumour claims it resides in the private collection of Dolores Umbridge, displayed in her pink curtained office as a trophy of victory over pure-blood supremacy. Others believe it was broken, the magic within too dangerous to preserve. A darker tale suggests that Draco Malfoy himself bribed a Ministry official to retrieve the pieces and buried them within the grounds of Malfoy Manor, never to be touched again. The loss of the cane signalled more than Lucius's decline in influence. It was a severance from his past. In the days following Voldemort's final defeat, Lucius was a shadow of himself. His robes lost their sheen, his hair, once immaculately tied, hung limp. He no longer walked with a purpose. Without the cane, he leaned on no one but walls and silence. Even during the trials that followed, Lucius avoided eye contact and said little. His lawyers spoke of remorse and family duty, but it was his silence that spoke loudest. He never once asked for the cane to be returned. Some believed he had accepted his loss. Others, more familiar with the ways of the Malfoys, believed he dared not let anyone else see the letter inside. He feared what it might say, what truths it could reveal if it fell into the wrong hands. Narcissa, as always, said nothing. But she once confided in Severus Snape, according to a confidential testimony now sealed in the pensive vaults, that Lucius would wake at night and reach instinctively for the serpent's head. When he found only empty air, he would go to the window and stare into the trees, motionless for hours. For a man like Lucius, the absence of that cane was a spiritual amputation. Draco, inheritor of both the wand and the burdens of his family name, never used the cane. Though he had the means to commission a new one, he chose instead to walk unaided. In public, he carried only a wand and a neutral face. But in private, he once said to Astoria, "The real wand wasn't the power, it was the silence it commanded." The magical world has many artifacts of great renown. The Elder Wand, the Resurrection Stone, the Cloak of Invisibility. But among collectors and historians there's a quiet reverence for items like Lucius Malfoy's cane, not because of their power, but because of the lives and legacies they carried, a symbol, yes, but also a vessel of memory, fear, and pride. The cane stood through generations as a quiet sentinel of the Malfoy legacy. In the end, its disappearance said as much about the fall of a family as the collapse of a regime. Even today, some believe the cane still exists, hidden in plain sight. It's said that during the reconstruction of Malfoy Manor's East Wing, a sealed chamber was discovered, lined with mirrors enchanted to reflect only truth. Within, under a stasis charm, lay the broken remnants of a black cane with a silver serpent's head, its emerald eyes still glowing faintly. The workmen were sworn to secrecy, and the room sealed again, forever part of the manor's bones. Lucius Malfoy lived a life built on appearances, but the cane he carried told a different story. A story of fear hidden behind arrogance, of love buried beneath legacy, and of a man who knew that sometimes what you carry in silence is louder than any spell you cast. Number 22, Lucius's role in Dobby's story. Lucius Malfoy was a man of lineage, wealth, and contempt. In the cold halls of Malfoy Manor, the grandeur of the old pureblood families reigned supreme, and none more so than Lucius himself, whose silver hair and icy glare became synonymous with aristocratic cruelty. Beneath his polished shoes the house elf Dobby served in silence, but that silence, so long endured, would one day echo through the walls of Hogwarts and shake the very foundation of Lucius's world. To the Malfoys, Dobby was not a being. He was a fixture, an inherited servant, a thing that existed only to obey. For years Lucius used him for the lowliest tasks, scrubbing, fetching, spying. There was no gratitude, no kindness, only commands and punishments. Dobby's ears had heard enough curses to fill volumes, and his body bore the invisible marks of a life spent under tyranny. Yet there was something strange in the elf, a flicker of defiance. It was this flicker that Lucius never noticed, or perhaps chose to ignore, until it was too late. When Harry Potter first encountered Dobby, he did not see a nameless servant. He saw a creature trembling with fear, warning him of danger, pleading with him to stay away from Hogwarts. "Harry Potter must not go back to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry this year," Dobby said, voice cracking with urgency. But behind this plea was a story of desperation and self-sacrifice. Dobby had taken it upon himself to defy his master, something unheard of among house elves. He had enchanted a bludger to injure Harry, sealed his mail, and even levitated a cake to fall on Mrs. Mason's head, all in a futile attempt to protect the boy from the plans brewing in the Malfoy household. Lucius had slipped Tom Riddle's diary into the belongings of Ginny Weasley, using the chaos to bring disgrace upon Arthur Weasley and advance his own position. Dobby knew of the diary, of its cursed power, of the danger that loomed over Hogwarts, but he also knew the consequences of speaking directly. Every warning was a violation. Every attempt to help Harry cost him pain. Dobby's punishments were severe. "Dobby had to punish himself, sir," he admitted later, revealing a system of control so deep it was self-enforcing. Lucius had conditioned his servant not just to obey, but to suffer for attempting anything more. It was within the walls of the Hogwarts hospital wing that Dobby finally found the courage to confess. The diary, the plan, the danger, all of it tied back to Lucius Malfoy. The elf had risked everything to warn Harry, and Harry, in turn, had listened. With the mystery of the Chamber of Secrets unravelled, it was time for a reckoning. Harry approached Lucius with calm defiance, the ruined diary in hand. But it was not just justice he sought, it was change. With a subtle stroke of brilliance, Harry wrapped one of his own socks into the pages of the diary and handed it back to Lucius, who, with arrogant disdain, thrust it into Dobby's chest. "Come, Dobby," he barked. But something had changed. The moment Dobby unwrapped the sock, he realized what had happened. Lucius had, however unintentionally, given him clothes. And in the world of house elves, this meant freedom. The look on Lucius's face was one of horror, an aristocrat caught in his own trap. "You've lost me my servant," he snarled. But Harry stood firm. "You shall not harm Harry Potter," Dobby said, and with a snap of his fingers, Lucius was hurled back by the very magic he had long used to dominate. For the first time, Lucius had tasted defeat. It was public, humiliating, and irreversible. And it had been delivered not by the Ministry or Dumbledore, but by a boy and a freed elf. This was no minor inconvenience. This was the unravelling of a world order. Lucius had relied on the silence of creatures like Dobby, on the fear that kept them bound. The loss of control over even one servant was a crack in the foundation of everything he believed. Dobby, in his freedom, became a symbol of rebellion, of justice, of the idea that power could be challenged. Lucius never forgave the humiliation. He walked away that day not just stripped of a servant, but of certainty. His attempt to retaliate in the very halls of Hogwarts showed a man unravelling. To draw a wand on a student, even one like Harry, in such a sacred place, was a dangerous act of desperation. And yet he did it. Lucius had always operated from behind the scenes, wealth, influence, fear. But now, like a cornered animal, he was lashing out in daylight. That act did not go unnoticed. Dumbledore's quiet presence and Dobby's intervention sealed Lucius's fall. No longer could he act with impunity. The whispers began in the Ministry, in Diagon Alley, even among the Death Eaters. Malfoy had been made a fool by a boy and a house elf. In the years that followed, Lucius's influence waned. He was no longer the untouchable, pure-blood noble. His family's name, once revered, became a cautionary tale. His role in slipping the diary to Ginny Weasley came under scrutiny. Though no charges stuck, the stain was permanent. The world had changed, and Lucius had not kept pace. Dobby, meanwhile, had found new purpose. No longer bound by chains, he chose to work at Hogwarts, not as a slave, but as a free elf. He wore his clothes proudly, mismatched and eccentric, but always symbolic. "Dobby is a free elf, and Dobby has come to save Harry Potter and his friends," he declared in the darkest of times during the Battle of Malfoy Manor. The irony was piercing. He had returned to the place of his enslavement, not in chains, but as a liberator. It was here, in the dungeons of the Malfoy estate, that Lucius would face his old servant again. The manor had become a prison, a place where Voldemort's power eclipsed even Lucius's ambitions. Reduced to a shadow of his former self, Lucius no longer held the authority he once flaunted. Narcissa's fear, Draco's silence, and the Dark Lord's contempt had hollowed the man. When Dobby arrived to rescue Harry and his friends, Lucius did not intervene. He watched, impotent, as the elf performed feats of magic he had never been allowed to use before. The final insult came as Dobby apparated them to safety. In that moment, the very creature Lucius had beaten, silenced, and enslaved became a hero. The cost was high. Dobby was struck down by Bellatrix Lestrange's knife, dying in Harry's arms. But even in death, he had done more for good than Lucius had in a lifetime. He had broken free, and in doing so had rewritten the rules. Lucius's role in Dobby's life was not just that of a master, He was the embodiment of everything Dobby fought against: oppression, cruelty, control. And when that hold was broken, it was Lucius who lost the most. His defeat began not with the rise of Voldemort, but with the fall of a sock into the hands of a servant. That sock, so trivial, so mundane, had become an artifact of revolution. "Master has given Dobby a sock," the elf had said. "Dobby is free." It was the sentence that rang like a bell across the wizarding world, one that heralded change. The old world of house elf bondage, of unquestioned dominance by the pure-blood elite, was no longer unchallenged. Lucius, unwittingly, had ignited the very spark he feared. The tragedy for Lucius was that he never understood Dobby's strength. He mistook obedience for weakness, silence for stupidity. He saw the elf's subservience as proof of superiority. But Dobby was never truly broken. His defiance grew in shadows, watered by cruelty, fed by the memory of every injustice. In the end, it was not hate that fueled his rebellion, but love for Harry, for freedom, for the possibility of a different life. Lucius Malfoy faded into disgrace, stripped of power, of favour, of purpose. He had tried to mould the world in the image of his own pride, but the world had changed. His final days were marked not by vengeance, but by emptiness. The old order had passed, and he was a relic left behind. But Dobby's legacy endured. At his grave, Harry carved the words that Lucius never could have spoken. "Here lies Dobby, a free elf." A simple phrase, yet weightier than all the proclamations of the Wizengamot. It was an epitaph not just for a life, but for an entire era. And so, in the quiet collapse of Lucius Malfoy's world, the role he played in Dobby's fate remained his most unintentional contribution to the future. He had tried to control, to own, to crush. Instead, he had set something free, and in doing so ensured that the age of silent servitude would never return unchallenged again. Number 23. The Last Meeting with Harry Potter. Lucius Malfoy had once commanded fear with nothing more than a glance. He was a man sculpted by power, influence, and an unwavering loyalty to a dark cause that ultimately collapsed beneath the weight of its own cruelty. But by the time Harry Potter saw him for the last time, the figure that once towered in the shadows of the Ministry's courtrooms was hardly a silhouette of his former self. It was the year 2007. The Ministry of Magic had restructured itself with astonishing efficiency following the Second Wizarding War. Gone were the days of whispered corruption in its corridors. A new wave of reformists led by Kingsley Shacklebolt and his trusted officials, including Hermione Granger, who by then was deputy head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, sought not just justice but understanding, even toward those who once stood against them. The closed-door meeting in question was part of a controversial reintegration program. Certain former Death Eaters who had surrendered willingly or aided the final resistance were promised immunity in exchange for cooperation. It was risky, unprecedented, and unpopular, but it was meant to build a future free of the shadows of vengeance. Hermione had been instrumental in designing the program. Harry Potter, now working closely with the Aura office and occasionally advising the Wizengamot, had agreed to attend the meeting, though reluctantly. Lucius Malfoy's name was not on the original list. That, in itself, surprised Harry. After the Battle of Hogwarts, the elder Malfoy had retreated from public life. While Narcissa's courageous lie about Harry's life had arguably saved him, and Draco's lack of true allegiance to Voldemort had spared him a harsher sentence, Lucius remained a more ambiguous figure. He had neither fought nor aided. He had existed in limbo. The Ministry had left him untouched, but under close watch. When Hermione informed Harry that Lucius had reached out quietly, through intermediaries, requesting to participate in the meeting, he hesitated. There was no anger left in him, not for Lucius, but neither was there forgiveness. For years, Lucius Malfoy had been the embodiment of everything Harry had fought against: elitism, cruelty masked by elegance, and that brand of superiority that suffocated kindness. Still, Harry agreed to attend, not as an aura, not as a war hero, but as a man who still carried the scars of that war deep in his bones. The room was plain, a rectangular table, dim candlelight, and 3 wizards besides Lucius. Harry remembered Thorfinn Roll, now a broken man nursing a limp and haunted eyes. Next to him sat Amicus Carrow, no longer sneering but strangely docile, and the third was Sabina Selwyn, who had turned ministry informant before the Battle of Hogwarts. Lucius sat apart, not just by distance but by demeanour. He had aged, but not with grace. His once silvery hair had thinned and dulled. His robes, though still expensive, hung loosely. His hands, always perfectly manicured in years past, were shaking. Harry watched him closely. There was no greeting, no nod of recognition, just silence. Hermione began the session by outlining the terms cooperation, transparency, and the understanding that no second chances would follow. The others gave their affirmations quickly. Lucius remained quiet. When asked directly if he agreed to the terms, he spoke, softly, clearly, and without hesitation. "I do," he said. It was the first word Harry had heard from him in nearly a decade, and though his voice still carried its aristocratic rhythm, it was muted, like music played from a broken instrument. The conversation turned to names, movements, and hidden caches of cursed artifacts. Lucius spoke when asked, never offering more than necessary, but never withholding either. He recalled the shipment of dark objects moved through Knockturn Alley, the secret gatherings in Wiltshire, the rituals performed beneath the manor's floorboards. He described with unsettling precision how his house had been taken over, how Voldemort's presence had poisoned the walls themselves. But when the topic turned to motivations, to remorse, something in Lucius's face shifted. Harry, who had been silent until then, leaned forward and asked, "Do you regret it?" The question hovered. Lucius didn't flinch. He merely lowered his eyes, and the silence that followed was heavier than any word. A full minute passed before he spoke again. "I was never strong," he said. "Not when it mattered. Not for what was right. I was afraid of losing everything, and I lost it all anyway." Harry watched him carefully, expecting excuses, bitterness, or even defiance, but none came. Lucius's gaze lifted briefly, not to meet Harry's, but to glance at a corner of the room where no one sat, as if searching for someone long gone. "My son," he added, "chose a better path. I thank whatever mercy spared him from becoming like me." It wasn't an apology, not in the traditional sense, but it was more than Harry had expected. The room remained quiet for a while after that. Even Amicus Carrow, who had once howled curses in the name of the Dark Lord, seemed subdued by Lucius's admission. When the meeting concluded, the others left in groups. Lucius stood slowly, adjusted his cloak, and paused at the door. For a moment, Harry thought he might say more, might turn and extend some final gesture of reconciliation. But he didn't. He merely nodded, not to Harry but to Hermione, and vanished through the ministry corridor. That was the last time Harry saw Lucius Malfoy. In the years that followed, Lucius removed himself from wizarding society altogether. He sold Malfoy Manor quietly and relocated to an undisclosed region in the Alps, according to rumours passed through Gringotts. He left no forwarding address, made no appearances, and wrote no memoirs. When the Daily Prophet published its 10-year retrospective on the war, his name was a mere footnote. Draco Malfoy, by contrast, rebuilt his life piece by piece. He married Astoria Greengrass and raised a son, Scorpius, whom he vowed would never carry the weight of his family's past. In interviews, Draco never spoke of his father, save for one moment recorded in the Quibbler, when asked if he resented Lucius. "No," he replied, "I pitied him, and I think he knew it." Hermione would later recount the meeting in her privately published memoir, In the Shadow of Victory. The chapter describing that day was titled The Echoes of War. She wrote, "There was no villain left in Lucius Malfoy, only a man who had been worn thin by the consequences of his silence." Harry rarely spoke of the encounter. He had long since stopped trying to categorize people as heroes or villains. The war had taught him that even the worst could break, and sometimes the broken chose to disappear, not out of shame, but because there was nothing left to fight for. In Lucius Malfoy he had seen a man who had finally understood the cost of his ambitions. It reminded Harry of a moment back in the Shrieking Shack during the war's final hours. As Snape lay dying, he had whispered, "Look at me, not for forgiveness but for recognition." Lucius hadn't asked for either, but the silence in that room had spoken of the same plea. To be seen, even if only once, as more than the sum of his mistakes. In the years that followed, whenever Harry walked past the portraits in the ministry, he would sometimes glance at the space where a painting of Lucius might have hung, if only his legacy had been different. But no such portrait existed, and Harry knew it never would. There were whispers that Lucius had taken up solitude as a form of penance, that he lived in a small cottage surrounded by frost-covered trees, never using magic unless absolutely necessary. Some said he kept a single photograph on his mantle, one of Draco and Scorpius, taken from a newspaper clipping. Whether this was true or not, Harry never investigated. There were many kinds of redemption. Some were loud and visible, others happened quietly, far from the gaze of history. Lucius Malfoy had chosen the latter, and in doing so perhaps had found peace. "Not all scars are visible," Harry once said to a group of young aurors in training, "and not every villain remains one forever." Lucius had never apologized for the diary, for the role he played in the Department of Mysteries, or for the fear he had inspired in his name. But that final moment, the crack in his carefully constructed persona, was enough for Harry to see him not as a Death Eater, but as a father who had lost his way. Some stories do not end with fireworks or redemption arcs. Some simply fade into silence, and sometimes that silence says enough. Number 24, Malfoy vs. Granger. A war that never ended. The war may have ended on the fields of Hogwarts, but for Lucius Malfoy the true battle never ceased. His name, synonymous with power, privilege, and ancient lineage, had been tarnished publicly, undeniably, and irreversibly. Yet it wasn't Harry Potter or even the Ministry's sentencing that truly haunted him in the years that followed. It was the image of a young woman standing tall, unafraid, with ink-stained fingers and a mind sharper than any wand. Hermione Granger. Lucius had faced many adversaries in his time, auras, political rivals, Death Eaters whose loyalty wavered, but none had threatened the very fabric of his world as much as Hermione. Her name alone became the symbol of everything he feared: change, equality, and the erosion of the hierarchy that had upheld his family's dominance for centuries. She didn't need a dark mark to wield power. Her strength was more subversive. It came from books, logic, and an unshakable moral compass. When Lucius first encountered Hermione at Flourish and Blotts during the infamous altercation between Arthur Weasley and himself, he dismissed her with a single contemptuous glance. A mere child, a mudblood. Yet even then, something about the way she clutched her books, a badge of intellect, unsettled him. She wasn't cowed by his wealth or his threats. She wasn't even frightened. That was the first fracture in the Malfoy certainty. It widened over the years. As the war began to heat, Lucius saw her as a nuisance, an annoyance clinging to Potter's coattails. But by the time the trio infiltrated the Ministry under Polyjuice Potion, his perception had begun to shift. "The mudblood is in the building," he had growled to a subordinate, not knowing just how close she truly was. Even then she was outmaneuvering him, walking unnoticed through the halls he once commanded. That humiliation never truly left him. In the aftermath of Voldemort's fall, Lucius avoided Azkaban through influence, legal maneuvering, and the subtle efforts of his wife Narcissa. But what truly stung wasn't the loss of status, it was who had risen in his place. Hermione Granger, now a rising star in the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, began pushing legislation that would have made his ancestors spin in their ornate crypts. House elf liberation, equal wand rights for goblins, even educational reforms that targeted the old bloodline-centric curriculum of Hogwarts. Every proposal felt like a personal strike. In the corridors of the newly restructured ministry, whispers followed them both. She, the war heroine with a vision of a just world. He, the symbol of a disgraced past, clinging to remnants of influence through sheer name alone. More than once, Lucius attempted to derail her efforts, using bureaucratic delays, exploiting procedural loopholes, even trying to manipulate allies within the Wizengamot. It was a quiet war, a shadow war, but it was war nonetheless. During the vote on the Goblin Representation Bill of 2003, Lucius arranged a closed-session debate that he believed would strip the bill of its teeth. Instead, Hermione arrived with a prepared 87-page brief that cross-referenced centuries of ministry corruption, including his own hand in the Gringotts Clause of 1974. Though not illegal, the exposure made him a subject of scorn among reformers. One headline from the Daily Prophet read, "Granger dismantles Malfoy legacy with ink and memory." Still, Lucius did not disappear. He pivoted instead, subtly aligning himself with conservative families who had remained neutral during the war. Together they formed the Heritage Preservation Committee, an advisory body ostensibly concerned with protecting magical tradition. Hermione saw it for what it was, a last-ditch effort to entrench old ideologies under new labels. She countered by founding the Magical Integration Task Force, directly challenging every policy he put forward. But it wasn't just politics, it was personal. In 2006, when Hermione authored The Unseen Chains, House Elves in Wizarding Britain, she included a chapter titled The Gilded Prison, which openly criticized the Malfoy family's centuries-long abuse of elf labor. She stopped short of naming Dobby, but the implication was clear. Lucius, furious, attempted to sue for defamation. The case never reached court. Kingsley Shacklebolt, then Minister for Magic, intervened, calling it a distraction from our national healing. Lucius never forgave the slight, yet, despite everything, it was Hermione, ironically, mercifully, who extended a hand of cautious cooperation. In 2009, during the werewolf employment reform hearings, she shocked the Assembly by proposing a subcommittee that included members from all branches of magical society, regardless of wartime allegiance. Her eyes had flickered briefly to Lucius. The message was unmistakable. She was giving him a chance, not for redemption, but for relevance. Years later, in a rare interview with the Wizarding Times, she admitted, "I didn't do it for him. I did it for us, for all of us. The future we're building doesn't have space for ghosts of the past unless they learn to live in the light." Lucius, to everyone's surprise, accepted the role. He sat in a circle with werewolves, muggleborns, and centaurs, his posture rigid, his voice clipped, but he showed up. He never thanked her publicly, but he never tried to undermine her again, at least not directly. In private, however, Lucius struggled with the new order. His home, once a bastion of pride and pedigree, became a mausoleum of former glories. Narcissa busied herself with charities, Draco with parenting. Lucius brooded in silence, rereading old genealogies as if hoping to find an answer in the ink. But even he began to understand that the world had shifted beneath his feet, and Hermione Granger, this insufferable mudblood from a Muggle family, had become one of the architects of that tectonic change. The old Lucius would have lashed out, but the new Lucius, the tired, greying man with less venom in his tongue, learned restraint. During the Magical Archives exhibition of 2014, he and Hermione stood within feet of each other before the portrait of the 12 founders. For a moment, they both gazed at the image of Salazar Slytherin. Lucius saw ambition. Hermione saw warning. Neither spoke, but those present said the silence between them was more charged than any duel. Their most public appearance together occurred in 2016, during the unveiling of the War Remembrance Wall in Diagon Alley. Hermione had been instrumental in its creation. Lucius had opposed it initially, arguing it valorized chaos, but when he stood before the names, so many names, he saw not just the dead, but the cost of clinging too tightly to ideology. Among the names, one stood out, Dobby, carved into the stone, small and unobtrusive, but unmistakably present. Lucius stared at it for a long time. He never spoke of what he felt that day, but those who knew him said he was never quite the same afterward. In a speech delivered months later, Hermione said, "Reconciliation doesn't mean forgetting, it means remembering and choosing better." Many interpreted this as a veiled reference to Lucius. She never confirmed it. He never denied it. By the late 2020s, Lucius Malfoy had retreated almost entirely from public life, but occasionally memos from his hand would reach the ministry, always meticulously written, always respectful. One such letter, dated 2027, praised a new interspecies diplomacy initiative led by Hermione. It was a brief note, almost formal, but she kept it, tucked in a drawer with no label, as if even she understood the quiet significance of what it meant. There was no truce signed between them, no moment of forgiveness or friendship. But the war between Lucius and Hermione didn't need an ending. It had served its purpose. One represented a world that clung to blood and birth, the other a world that chose justice over tradition. And in that long, silent struggle, something unexpected emerged, not peace, perhaps, but understanding. Lucius Malfoy never forgot who she was, but he learned to live in a world she helped shape. That perhaps was the greatest victory Hermione Granger ever won, not with spells, not with titles, but with patience, resolve, and the unshakable belief that even the darkest hearts might, in time, find the will to stand in the light. And sometimes that's the only magic that matters. Number 25, the dark mark that wouldn't fade. The dark mark was not merely ink, it was not simply a tattoo, nor a magical brand to be scrubbed away with healing salves and incantations. It was a declaration, a binding promise made in blood and shadow. For Lucius Malfoy, the mark remained long after the man to whom it was pledged had crumbled into dust. Even after the final fall of Lord Voldemort, after the battle at Hogwarts where ideals shattered and masks fell, the dark mark persisted. A ghostly scar on pale flesh, dimmed but never erased. Lucius had once worn it with pride. In the marble halls of Malfoy Manor, he had traced it absent-mindedly during meetings with fellow Death Eaters, his thumb brushing over the inked skull and serpent as though touching the very breath of power. He was a man of status, of lineage and tradition, and in Voldemort's new order he envisioned a rightful place for the old families. But dreams of legacy turned to ash when power slipped from the Dark Lord's grasp. Lucius found himself not in glory but in disgrace, and the mark, once a badge of honor, transformed into a chain. After Voldemort's final defeat, the mark ceased to burn. It no longer pulsed with magic, no longer summoned its bearer to battle or punishment. But it lingered on his arm, a dull and sullen shadow beneath the skin. Narcissa saw it once, in the hush of evening as he changed for bed, and said nothing. She didn't need to. Lucius turned away quickly as though ashamed of something once treasured. He began wearing longer sleeves, even in the warmth of summer. The manor's halls were cool, but his shame was hot. He tried to remove it, of course, in secret. Even his house elf was dismissed before the rituals began. He pored through ancient grimoires, leather-bound and brittle, written in archaic runes by warlocks long dead. From the vaults of the Malfoy family's private library, he unearthed texts banned by the ministry, books he once confiscated during his time as a governor of Hogwarts. Among them, a tome by Salazar Caro, a bloodthirsty sorcerer of the 14th century, claimed to possess spells of magical purification. Lucius cast them all. The mark remained. He paid handsomely for potions brewed in the swamps of Moldova, vials delivered by witches with eyes like smoked glass, a mixture of wolfsbane and thestral blood said to purge cursed symbols from flesh. He drank them. He bled from his mouth, his skin turned waxen, and Narcissa nearly called a healer. But the mark remained, unmoved and mocking. He bore its silence more painfully than its former sting. Rumours swirled, carried on owl wings and whispered in Nocturne Alley. It was said that Lucius Malfoy had journeyed to the Carpathians under the cover of night, seeking out the remaining sects of Voldemort loyalists who had retreated into the shadows. They were broken men and women, believers, without a banner. Some still performed rituals in the name of the Dark Lord, clinging to the magic of old. Lucius did not seek their company for reverence. He offered them galleons, artifacts, and rare spellbooks in exchange for knowledge. They tried blood rites. They tried fire. The mark did not fade. To the public, he was a man of remorse. He stood beside his wife during ministry investigations, head bowed, voice controlled, expressing repentance. "We were misled," he said once during a hearing. "My only loyalty now is to the future of our world." Kingsley Shacklebolt believed him, or at least chose to. The ministry agreed to leniency in exchange for full cooperation. The Malfoys were spared Azkaban, but Lucius could not escape himself. The mark on his arm told the truth he wished to bury. Even Draco could see it. The boy who had once bragged in Hogwarts corridors about his father's connections now walked the halls of Malfoy Manor in silence, his eyes avoiding the place where the mark lay. Lucius noticed the subtle things, how his son never sat too close, how he paused before reaching out to touch him. The mark made Lucius not only a former Death Eater, it made him a relic of fear, a man bound to history, unable to scrub clean. The irony was cruel. The dark mark was supposed to be a promise of immortality, not in body but in cause. Voldemort had said as much. "And you, my faithful Lucius, your loyalty shall be etched into your very flesh. You will be more than a man. You will be an ideal." Lucius had believed those words. Now they haunted him. He sometimes stared at his arm by candlelight, watching the mark breathe faintly with the pulse of his blood. It had grown fainter over time, like a memory, but it was still there, a stain no light could reach. He thought of Severus Snape, the man who bore the same mark and yet died a hero. His mark had died with him, or so Lucius hoped. Perhaps death was the only solvent. There was a time when Lucius believed magic could solve anything. That time was long gone. His world, once gilded with power and prestige, had narrowed to a few quiet rooms in a house too large. He refused most invitations. He no longer visited the Wizengamot, though his seat remained. He kept to himself like an old man who had lost more than time could heal. Yet the mark kept him company, in mirrors, in dreams. One winter evening he attended a memorial for the fallen of the Battle of Hogwarts. It was held in Hogsmeade, beneath a sky choked with snow. Lucius stood in the back, his cloak buttoned high. He did not speak to anyone. A child ran past and brushed his arm, then stopped and stared at him, not at his face, but at the slight shadow of the mark that showed beneath his glove. The child said nothing and ran off, but Lucius felt his heart pound. Even children knew he considered amputation a wild thought, a dangerous one. But he had read about wizards who had severed cursed limbs in desperation. Some had survived, most had not. Narcissa would never allow it. She had already watched the man she loved deteriorate year by year into a figure of guilt. He was no longer cruel, nor proud, nor sharp-tongued. He was a man haunted not by ghosts, but by choices. The mark in some ways kept him honest. It reminded him of what he had done, of who he had followed, of what he had allowed to happen. To children, to innocents, to his own son. It was not only a punishment, it was truth. An inescapable truth branded in magical ink. He once tried burning it away with mundane flame. He held a silver lighter to his arm, the flame steady, his teeth clenched. Narcissa found him moments later. He said nothing. She took the lighter, kissed his forehead, and left the room. The mark was untouched, immune even to pain. He dreamed of Voldemort often, not in nightmares, but in memories distorted by time. The great hall of Malfoy Manor, the gleam of Nagini's eyes, the sound of Bellatrix's laughter as prisoners screamed. He woke with a sweat and found his hand on the mark, as though checking if it had grown darker. It never did. It never faded either. Years passed. Draco married, and his own son was born, Scorpius. Lucius never held him with bare arms. The mark was never meant for a child to see. But one day Scorpius reached for his grandfather's sleeve, curious. Lucius recoiled softly. The boy blinked and asked no questions. Lucius never forgot that look. It was the beginning of another silence. Some days he sat in the garden and simply watched the birds. They did not know of Death Eaters or dark marks or prophecy. He envied them. The wind stirred the leaves, and sometimes he imagined it whispering names. Dumbledore, Potter, Snape. Men who had chosen differently. The mark, now faded to the colour of coal dust, still lived beneath his skin. It would go with him to the grave, of that he was sure. Wizards would one day write about the Second War, about heroes and villains. They would debate the guilt of men like Lucius, but none would understand the burden of carrying the mark after the cause had died. It was not pride, it was not shame, it was permanence. And so Lucius Malfoy remained, not in hiding, but in waiting, for redemption that would never come, or perhaps had already come and gone, for the moment when time itself would claim the arm and the mark with it. But until then, he bore it, not for Voldemort, not for fear, but as a quiet testimony to history, because some marks are not meant to vanish. Some truths must remain visible, even in silence, even in shadow, even in the end.